What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto fell for a villain he was meant to kill? If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments, and also check the description box to original creator of this beautiful creation. Years later, when he would finally think back to it, Naruto would say that one single day had been the beginning of the end of his old way of life. He might even go so far as to say it was one of the greatest days of his young life. Right next to the day he discovered the wonder known as foreign takeout food, of course. At the time though, he would have told anyone who dared to ask him about the whole matter that it had to have been a moderately, if not fairly, horrible day. It was the day after his 13th birthday, and he was dealing with things the only way he knew how to. He had never meant it to happen, truly he hadn't. It had been an accident, a slip-up, a mistake. He hadn't meant to cut himself that deeply, in all honesty he hadn't. He had simply applied a little too much pressure on the kunai knife he had been using to slice his arms with, that was all. Not a big deal. Not a big deal at all. It wasn't like he wanted to end his life or anything so drastic. That thought hadn't crossed his mind in a very long time. But that's how everyone would think of him now, he was sure of it. Poor little Naruto. The suicidal, self-mutilating teenager. It wasn't a very big deal, this cutting thing. But he was sure that everyone else would make it one. As was stated before, he knew he wasn't suicidal. He'd been sure of that rather sad fact for several long years. He had learned of a new way to cope with things. Instead of just having the idea planted into his mind that if things got too out of hand for him he could always just kill himself, he now had a solution that wasn't so permanent. No, he hadn't had a thought like that since he was about 8 when he had discovered this new, he would now silently describe to himself, friend. The heat that raced down his back and neck, that wonderfully cool shiver that came with every slice along his flesh calmed him. It made him forget that there were people who hated his presence, his very existence. Even if it was for only a short time, the scars were most certainly worth it. Yes, scars. The boy whom everyone thought was to always be unscathed, these very normal human markings, only because of the options that he could not choose from when they were given to him, had scars. Not that anyone had ever seen them, he made sure of that. Naruto remembered the day when he made what he had, at the time, called one of his biggest blunders of all. Right next to trying to dye the late Hokage's remaining hair neon pink and green while he was napping. What he had been doing was plain and simple. He was having a really bad day and was dealing with it the only way he had ever really known. It had started on the upper arms, which were fairly, if not incredibly, easy to hide. Even without using the jutsu he had invented years ago just for hiding the products of his odd ability, or rather his inability, to cope with strong emotions. All of this was fine and dandy, and would have stayed fine and dandy had the cuts not moved from upper arm to his forearm. The cuts had started off small, nothing to be taken seriously at all. One might even go so far as to say they were just simply paper cuts that would heal in a day or two tops. Then the paper cuts turned into nicks. Nicks then turned into cuts, then cuts turned into small slashes, and then the small slashes proceeded to become small gashes. And then somewhere along the way there was a moment when the small gashes decided, we're done for right now, thank you. Go try the large gashes for a bit please, and promptly developed into a very serious wound. And that's when things decided it'd be a good moment in time to turn against him. He could tell immediately that he had cut himself too deeply. Blood had poured from his self-inflicted wound, far too much far too fast. His other wounds seemed insignificant and minute compared to the one he had just created. The red liquid cascaded down his arm to pool in his palm in a sickening fashion. And for the first time in his life, Naruto had been truly afraid of what he considered to be his only way of coping. The kunai had fallen to the floor with a dulled thump and the blood that had pooled in his palm fell to the floor and had splashed onto his orange jacket like water as he struggled to get it off of his body. Shit, he had hissed through his clenched teeth. His heartbeat sped as the bleeding refused to stop. He had tried to phase the rivets of blood flowing from his arm with his standout orange jacket, changing the coat's color from bright orange to bloody crimson red literally in a matter of seconds. He remembered having backed up against the wall, slumping to the ground. His blood had flowed silently from his abused arm onto the concrete floor. The liquid seeped through his once orange now crimson jacket, creating a small, deep red puddle around himself. Naruto could still distinctly remember how weak he had felt, as if something had sucked all the energy out of his body. It vaguely reminded him of the feeling of being absolutely spent, like the after effects of an orgasm. He known exactly what the after effects of an orgasm felt like is an entirely different story that will be saved for another day. Even years after, he could still remember how the wet, coppery smell of his cooling blood had filled his nose as it had poured quicker and quicker out of him with every heartbeat. He could still remember how his heart had hammered in his ears, making it difficult to concentrate on anything else except for his newly made headache. He could remember thinking that this would be it, the end of him. And oddly enough, he found no real fear in the thought. Sure, he had wanted to make something of himself, to prove he could. But then again, if death came for him, he had thought, it wouldn't be so bad either. Through all the pounding in his head, Naruto had heard a knock on his door. A voice had called his name. He had turned his head to face the door from where he was sitting on the floor in his kitchen. All he had been able to do to respond was grunt as loudly as he could. He still could never remember when his throat had started to feel so dry though. Naruto had heard his front door creak open noisily, damn hinges, and the person had stepped in. He could still faintly remember them stopping as soon as they had seen him sitting on the kitchen floor, a puddle of his own life giving red liquid surrounding him. Even with the darkness of unconsciousness clouding his eyes, he could still make out whom the person's face had belonged to. To this day he could still remember as those dark eyes had tried so very hard to stay indifferent to the situation at hand. Sasuke? He had managed to cough out before he had let himself fall into the welcoming arms of sleep. In his mind, he had slept for only a moment. A blissful moment that held no nightmares, no pain, no fear, not a thing. All that was there was the smell of cinnamon sugar cookies. For some reason he could not recall at that exact second in time, the scent made him want to cry in regret. It's a simple thing really. Just to get me through the day. And yet everyone will worry. Don't tell me otherwise, it's what they do best. But it's not what I want, these razor-free walls. I'm not crazy, so why do you have me stay here? As his mind drifted its way back to reality, Naruto noticed two things. 1. He had the distinct feelings of being in a place not to his liking, and 2. He couldn't move his arms. Slowly opening his eyes, he was met with a stark white ceiling and an array of rather annoyingly bright lights. Waiting a moment for his eyes to adjust, Naruto had one thing on his mind. Where in the name of all things holy am I? From what he could tell in the rather immobile situation he found himself in, he'd been taken out of his blood-soaked clothes and had been put in a pair of washed-out blue short-sleeve pajamas. Shortly after making his brilliant deduction, his stomach growled in an attempt to say, "Feed me now." Looking on either side of himself, he could see the restraints that were holding him to the bed. Wondering for a moment, Naruto tried to move his legs. No luck. Slowly but surely, something drastic came to Naruto's mind. Someone new. Despite all his cautions and close calls, all it had taken for all that to mean nothing was for him to screw up just this once. Just once, and someone had found him out. Someone now knew just how fucked up he was. And of all people to see him that weak and in that mental state, why did it have to be Sasuke? Why did it have to be you fucking Chia Sasuke? Trying very hard to not start having a small mental breakdown, Naruto focused very deeply on his breathing, hoping to find some sort of calming point in doing it. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. A doctor had come in some time after, watching Naruto for a moment as the boy seemed to be doing some sort of meditation practice, his deep breaths a tad bit shaky. The doctor broke the heavy breathing-laden silence with a simple greeting. "Hello Uzumaki-san, how are you today?" The heavy breathing quieted at those words. The doctor was young, no older than 29, with short messy black hair. Scraggly hairs on his face seemed to be attempting a beard at the end of his chin. Warm chocolate eyes were placed behind a pair of glasses, 2 earrings piercing the upper lobe of his left ear. He was known around the hospital for his sarcastic humor, this same trait making him strangely very compatible with teenagers and young adults. As the doctor busied himself with writing something on his clipboard he had brought in with him, a question was asked. "Why am I strapped down?" The doctor turned to him and looked him in the eyes for a moment. All he saw was a quiet want to help, to heal, to mend his sores in some way, shape or form. Those chocolate depths, Naruto noticed, held no resentment, fear, or hatred as they turned on him. "You're on a suicide watch." The doctor answered. "Really? Was the only slightly intelligent thing to come out of his mouth. Yep, you most certainly are. Why don't we get you unstrapped for a little bit and see how that arm of yours is doing? As buckles were loosened and straps undone, Naruto asked another question. What's your name? Ataki Satoshi. Satoshi answered as he slowly unwrapped the gauze from Naruto's damaged forearm. Naruto couldn't meet the doctor's eyes as the cut that had been surgically sewn shut was examined. Having exposed his tarnished flesh to no other eyes but his own, Naruto felt a new and sudden wave of shame and self-loathing surge through him. The feeling tinted his cheeks a bright red color in embarrassment. It was bad enough to have one wound exposed, but to have all cuts and scars old and new exposed as well just added to more weight to his embarrassment. It's healing nicely. You're pretty lucky it didn't get infected, was the only thing Satoshi said before the arm was rewrapped in new gauze and given back to its owner. A while later a nurse whom looked to be in her 50s wheeled in a tray of food, if you could even try and call it real food. The brownish-golden broth of the soup sloshed in its small plastic bowl. Little bits of what appeared to be meat and vegetables swimming their way to the surface because of the quick movement of the cart before sinking back to the bottom of the broth like water. The little sandwich that came with the soup had just about as much appeal as the soup had, meaning which, they were both about as wide as a hairy man in a sailor costume 2 sizes too small. The only things on the tray that looked at all appealing at all were the tall glass of water and little paper cup that no doubt held a set of pills in it for him to take. As the doctor was busy writing yet more notes onto his clipboard, the nurse busied herself with placing the tray of food onto a small, half-table on wheels thing that sat in front of Naruto. All the while sneering harshly at the blonde. Naruto ignored her, looking down at his hands and picked at his fingernails. And as she left, Naruto finally looked up at the food she had haphazardly placed in front of him. As he stared at it, he silently hoped that it would somehow turn into a nice bowl of rice or dumplings or at least something else, something more pleasant to look at in the least. When all hoping of any kind failed, he sighed to himself and couldn't help but feel sympathy for those who had to eat this kind of food more than for a few days in a row. He took a deep breath and quietly ate the food as quickly as possible. I'm surprised you didn't choke on that, the way you inhaled it. Dr. Satoshi said with a hint of awe in his voice as he watched Naruto manage to swallow his last bit of what he found to be a slightly stale tuna sandwich. I'd prefer to risk choking than to actually see what it tastes like, was Naruto's only comment, which was received by a knowing laugh from the doctor. What are these? Naruto asked once he had finished his meal, indicating to the 2 small pills in the paper cup. Sleeping pills, you happen to have lost a lot of blood. Even with your naval friend, the doctor quoted with his hands, your body still needs to rest to be able to make up for all of the blood you managed to lose. I'd like you to take them before I strap you back in. The doctor answered. Naruto grumbled, but complied as he popped the pills into his mouth. He let them sit on his tongue for a moment before washing them down with a big gulp of water from the tall glass. The doctor walked back to the bed as Naruto settled back in, listening carefully to the clinking of metal and the faint scratching of leather against it. There was a moment of silence before. What's going to happen to me? Naruto asked, sounding fairly drowsy already. I don't know yet. Right now, we just need to make sure your body is healed before we start trying to mend your mind. Dr. Satoshi answered honestly, continuing with the straps. Naruto had nothing to say to that. The room seemed to spin several ways before Naruto passed out once again. The next 2 days passed in this manner. This manner meaning that Naruto was unbuckled to eat, drink and go to the bathroom, but strapped onto the bed any other time. By the end of the suicide watch, he vowed that he would forever and ever appreciate the ability to be able to move his body freely. His dreams on those days where he lay strapped to a bed were very peculiar, to say in the least anyways. One dream he could remember had been about one of his first true discussions with Kyuubi that had happened only a few months ago in reality. And it happened to actually be one of the only conversations they'd ever had that did not involve the fox giving him chakra as rent. It had been about why his self-inflicted injuries never seemed to heal as quickly as those that he hadn't given to himself. It's because you're the one who made them, you put them there. I'm not about ready to ruin your fun little one. The huge fox in his dream had said, just as the original conversation had gone. The fox's voice, whenever Naruto had heard it, always seemed very gruff and a bit sultry, but ancient and thick with an accent that Naruto had never heard before. That was, until he met Kyuubi, of course. To many, the words would have seemed mean and extremely spiteful, full of hatred even. But to Naruto's trained ear, he could tell it was Kyuubi's way of saying, "I'm sorry I can't help you any more than letting you have this shitty habit. I can do nothing else for you." It made him feel slightly warm and fuzzy when he thought about it, knowing that Kyuubi cared. Given, it was in an odd, sadistic, all-around interesting and slightly twisted way. The next dream he could remember had been of that day. The single most day he would gladly forget as long as he lived. When he had woken up, he found he had unconsciously been biting his lip, keeping a scream tucked away into his throat. Eyes full of sharp pain as he kept tears from pricking the corners of his eyes, silently trying to prove to an invisible someone how strong he was. That night and all of the next morning, all he could taste in his mouth was the coppery bitterness of blood and salt from the tears that had eventually fallen. The doctor would walk in the next morning to see him staring intently at the ceiling, eyes half-lidded in what looked like exhaustion. And the last dream he had had that was remembered had been of when he was 8, on the day he had first intentionally hurt himself. To his surprise, he could still see his small arms in his dream, covered in little bloody cuts. He left the hospital in a terrible mood, occupied by a young brown-haired woman in her mid-20s who was dressed in a simple shirt and blue jeans. He scratched, with much aggression I might add, at his bandaged arm, covered by the thin material of the long-sleeved shirt he was wearing. He and the woman said nothing as they walked to his apartment, a fact he was quite happy with. He reached into the pocket of the sweatpants the hospital had provided him with, pulled out his key, unlocked the door, and slammed it open. One would have to be blind, deaf, and have the inability to feel vibrations to not know that the boy was pissed. Pissed beyond all belief and reason possible. Just making him go to a shrink every day would be better than what they had done. The hospital had done something that he really couldn't forgive. They were sending him to a nut house. And to add salt to the festering wound, the name of the establishment happened to be Happy Hills Rehabilitation Center. Who in their right mind would give a building a name like that unless they wanted every single person who passed it to say, "Yep, that's where all the town freaks live." It's kind of like they have their own commune in there or something. The apartment was how he had left it, including a dark stain that was chipping away on the cement floor. Naruto bustled about. Grabbing a duffel bag he had from underneath his bed, he set it open upon the bed, and began rummaging through his closet for the things he needed to bring. Out of the corners of his eyes he watched the woman look around his apartment, even going up to the few pictures he had hung on the wall with a nail and hammer to get a better look at them. One was a picture of his team that Kakashi had taken with a timer camera, so he could be in it as well. The other was of Haruka sitting at Naruto's favorite ramen stand, waving and smiling at the camera. Naruto had taken that picture himself. The last picture was of all of his friends, him included, smiling at the camera. He couldn't remember why the picture had been taken or why they had all been at the same place at the same time. But it was still nice to see such a happy moment captured. As his chaperone's mind was obviously somewhere else, he took the opportunity to shove his extremely old CD case and CD player into the duffel bag. The chaperone studied the tiny kitchen with its small table and lone chair, the other pulled to the side, a thick layer of dust settled on it. She looked at all the plants Naruto owned, from the ones he had bought, to the ones he had found, to the ones he had grown himself. For some odd reason, she felt a sudden wave of loneliness sweep through the apartment, as if the emotion had simply permeated the walls and decided to randomly attack her. She shook slightly, realizing that this poor boy had to live here. She had gotten chills from just visiting. What would happen, she wondered, to someone who had to live here? She glanced at Naruto's back, recalled where they were headed to and let her thoughts fall silent. Deciding he had enough underwear and other necessities, Naruto zipped up the bag and made his way to the door. "Who's going to take care of these plants?" the woman finally spoke. A pause. "I don't know. I wasn't planning on telling anyone I know about where I have to go. I guess they'll end up dying all alone," Naruto answered sadly. Yet another pause, this one filled with thought. "I could take care of them for you," she said. Naruto thought about it for a moment before answering. "All right." As he finished locking the door, he handed the key to the woman and they continued on their way. Even if it was still fairly early in October, the wind outside the apartment was extremely crisp and cool. Naruto breathed in deeply. He both loved and hated the fall. Everyone usually saw it as a season of mourning for those lost when the Kyuubi had attacked. This always brought the several large handfuls of villagers that held dislike towards him out into their full glory. The season brought that, most of the year, dislike up to almost completely open hatred. Yes, it was a fact that there were only a few handfuls of people in the village who actually held him responsible for what had happened when he had been nothing but a newborn. Most would think this a good thing, and in all truth, it is. Except for the fact that these few handfuls had enough zeal in their cause of make the demon child suffer, to fill up a fairly large swimming hole. Let's put it this way, as simply as it can be possibly put. What would have taken a huge number of people with minimum to no zeal would only take a handful of these people if their said zeal and minds were set to it. It'd be fine if their zeal and minds weren't set making a young boy's life hell. But that wasn't the case at all, much to Naruto's disadvantage. Fall was also the season his birthday was in. Most, if not all, people look forward to their birthdays. Not he, his birthday usually meant a good hard day of staying clear of those handfuls of people with more zeal than needed. It also meant that he might or might not have a broken into apartment to come home to. But he did love the way it smelled during fall. Like a cave, moist and dry at the same time. It was like the earth, the way it smelled right after a rain shower. Clean with a hint of must mingled together with the feeling of heavy clouds in the sky. The wind was never too warm nor too cold, and it always seemed to smell like a clean river mixed with the smell of fresh apples. And yet, his most favorite thing of all was when the wind happened to be strong enough to whip up the leaves and all around you suddenly was made up of harmless flames. And even better yet, if you were in a dense enough part of the forest, and if the sun was in the right place, and you decided to look up, the sky could look like it were on fire. But no one knew he knew these things about the fall, and that was all right with him. Both he and the woman walked through the streets of Konoha. As the mid-October air blew about, people glanced questioningly at Naruto and the woman. Or more like a few glared at Naruto, while most glanced at both. Most simply glanced and went back to what they were doing before. Few were curious as to why someone was willingly walking with that good-for-nothing monster. Though, it might have had something to do with the fact that Naruto was wearing something different for once. The hospital had given him a simple pair of baggy sweatpants, along with a long-sleeved shirt, for obvious reasons, both of which happened to be a dark gray. He thought it funny though, that people seemed to notice him more with such dark clothes on, as opposed to the other brightly colored clothes he actually owned. As they turned the corner, Naruto realized he had no idea where he was. After all his life of running up and down these streets, trying to get in and out of trouble, he couldn't believe that there was a part of the village that he hadn't yet seen. They continued to walk on in silence for 10 minutes or so, until the woman halted in front of a huge 4-story building. It seemed ancient in its own way, giving off an aura of having been through far too much far too quickly. He saw that it wasn't exactly tall, but extremely wide and long. Physically, the only thing that could be considered wrong with it was the paint chipping and peeling off its outer walls. There was a sign hanging above the entrance that read Happy Hills Rehabilitation Center. The sky blue paint on it was falling away as well. Naruto stopped right before the entrance to the building, a huge amount of fear suddenly enveloping him. It took the woman a second to realize he had stopped at all. He stared up at the building, eyes wider than normal. Now it was bearing down on him. He was going to be locked up. The key was going to be ripped from his grasp. He knew as soon as he walked in, there was no possible way to stop whatever was to happen in there. And the single thought of begin with no control at all, having no control yet again, it scared Naruto to death. "You okay?" the woman said, holding out her hand as a sign of comfort, completely unaware of just how scared the poor boy was. Naruto sighed and closed his eyes, trying to force the lump that seemed to have formed in his throat back down to his gut, his fear following suit. "No," he said truthfully as he pushed past the woman's hand and into the building. The blast of warm air that hit him as he entered was rather nice, it put feeling back into his cold cheeks. The room had a high ceiling and honey mustard painted walls. Fans that were in their off-season hung from the ceiling, dust collecting onto them silently. The walls had copies of what looked like considerably famous art hanging on them in different spots. Rows of chairs filled the floor, some of them occupied with people. A long stretch of desks could be seen just past the chairs, and to the right of these chairs, Naruto's right, was a door that held what looked like a large staircase. The woman led the way past the rows of chairs, and almost past the desks, before they were stopped. "Do you need some help?" a squat little woman said from the desk closest to them. "No, I'm just bringing this one up to the third floor, first section." The woman stared at Naruto for a moment before nodding her head in consent. As they started up the stairs once again, the silence that came was by all means greeted. They finally stopped climbing the huge spiral staircase when they reached the third level, entering its main office through the door. The room itself was small, beige-colored walls and a large, fake plant tree sitting in a far corner. In another corner of the room sat a rather small, wooden desk, a young woman its sole occupant. She too looked fairly young, 19 at the oldest, with her hair pulled back into a loose bun, a dark blue shirt covering her torso and dark blue jeans covering her lower half. She was giggling madly over a small book with a purple cover, a bright red disclaimer on the back reading, "By no means is this meant for children. 18 years or older. Kirava-san? Kirava-san, I have another one of Dr. Satoshi's patients. I was told he's to go to section 1. The woman said to the girl behind the desk. The giggling stopped and a head popped out from behind the book. "Good luck," the woman whispered into his ear as she snuck back down the stairs. And within 2 seconds of her words, he realized he really was going to need some good luck. "Yes, ma'am," she yelled at the now vacant spot where the woman had stood not but a few moments ago. "Follow me, Uzumaki-san," she said in a sing-songy voice. On second thought, a lot of good luck might have been called for at that point. Not surprisingly, whenever she spoke, Naruto was certain that she had the inner monologue of a small child. Picking up a folder from the desk in the corner, she led him down a long hallway, until they reached the first door of said hallway and entered it. "We're going right here right now, we're going right here right now, we're going, and we're going right here right now." As sung to, roughly, the tune of the farmer in Dell, Kirava sang as she led him down the halls of the room they had entered. As she led him down several other hallways, he spotted what looked like several empty classrooms, 2 bathrooms, a very large dorm room, a recreational room, and a sort of lounge room. He also noticed all the windows they passed seemed fairly thin, and had no bars covering them as he had feared. One thing that struck him as odd though was that all of those rooms, excluding a few of the rooms that looked like classrooms, had no doors of any kind. This included the 2 bathrooms and bedroom, of sorts, he'd seen, which gave him a nice set of chills running down his back. No door to keep people out, to keep them from seeing him at his worst. It wasn't something Naruto was accustomed to. "Here we are, sir," she said enthusiastically as she led him to another very large dorm room. The right side of the room was comfortably filled with beds and small side table dresser. The wall was painted a rather disgusting green color that was peeling off the walls in the corners, cobwebs collecting an insurmountable amount of dust. The beds were lined up in 4 rows, each row with 6 beds. A tiny bit of math later left Naruto with the number 24 as the room's max occupant number. The few shirts, shoes, and dust bunnies on the floor made it feel like any other old school dorm. Had it not belonged to this particular building, no one could guess it was meant for mentally screwed up people in a rehabilitation center. "Here ya go, sir," she said, pulling out 2 pieces of paper from her small folder and handed each one to him. "This is an overview of the rules here and this one's your schedule. I hope everything goes okay for you and I hope you do good," she said, bounding out of the room like a hyperactive rabbit. Naruto could do nothing but stare at her as she departed, her source of intense energy a great puzzle for Naruto. As the shock of such an extremely hyper person being up in his face trickled out of him, he felt extremely drained, and depressed to boot. He let himself sink into the bed he was assigned, holding his head in his hands. He felt his bag and paper slid out of his hand, far too exhausted to care. When was the last time he'd felt this cornered? Of course, he didn't mean physically cornered. Trying not to think on it too deeply just yet, Naruto came to a simple conclusion. He was on the verge of everyone he knew finding out one of his greater secrets. He would be more than likely forced to talk about things he'd prefer to keep locked up. And what was worse, through all of this extra stress he would inevitably have to deal with, he wouldn't be able to even look at something that was sharp enough to hurt himself with. No one was going to let him do so now. They'd made him go cold turkey, as they called it. Surprisingly enough, it was that single thought that scared him the greatest. All in all, his simple, undeniable conclusion was this. He was, In all the ways you could possibly look at the situation from a mental wellness standpoint, fucked. He was up to his neck in his own stinking shit. Sighing heavily, Naruto rubbed the light bags that had begun to form under his eyes, hoping against all of reality that the last few days could somehow just be an awful dream. And while he was already vying for reality to break itself, all he really wanted was for the floor to come alive and swallow him up. But as always, reality was a bitch who played by no one else's rules but her own and took no favors or bribes. His head shot up as the sound of feet came pounding into the room. A woman appeared in the doorway, looking around frantically. "Excuse me, have you seen the woman? She looked like a visitor of some type, her visitor badge hanging from her shirt," in the doorway said. "I know you." She started again, her eyes taking on a harsh glare. Naruto opened his mouth to retort in some way, but she stopped him as she continued. "You're that monster, Kyuubi. You're the murderer from 13 years ago, the one the fourth sealed into that poor child. How despicably, why come to a house of the sick at mind? Do you have no mercy, you monster?" She spat, turning her nose up into the air as she finished her speech. "May whatever god exist damn you to hell." She finished, waltzed out of the room, an odd gleam in her eyes. Naruto continued to smile at her as she left, the muscles of his mouth laxing as soon as she was out of sight. If he had allowed himself to call after her, if he had the guts to call her on her own damn stupidity. If, Naruto couldn't help but feel that his inner monologues had increasingly built up a lot of what-ifs in them. He didn't like it that he was questioning so much of what he did or what he'd already done. It didn't help any when he was trying to sleep. Naruto sighed shakily, wondering how to force the lump back down his throat. The idea of bar-less windows crept into his head. For whatever reason, Naruto would probably blame it on some higher power later. He had a mad craving for a tiny lick of revenge. Oh, he knew he'd get in deep shit for what he planned to pull when all was said and done, but the idea had not left him be since it had been conceived in his mind all but 20 minutes prior. He finally caught up to the woman, several hallways down from the dorm room. She was exactly where he needed her to be for this tidbit of fun to happen properly. Thank God for bar-less windows. "Hey, fat cow," he called to her. She swung around, opening her mouth to probably spill another string of insults. "I hope you go to hell, bitch," he yelled over her impending wave of anger, bolting right towards the window and crashing through it. With his arms over his face, he dropped 3 stories and rolled gracefully onto the ground, getting to his feet. Smiling to himself as he heard the woman's yells from 3 stories up, and as the jagged glass cut into his flesh, he ran. He was glad to be out of that damn corner, even if it would only be for a little while. A little while was better than no while at all. Tsunade sighed. She was so exhausted at this point she wasn't sure if her elbows were resting on the top of her desk or on the ground below it. "Hokage-sama, there's been an urgent report from the rehab center." Who'd have thought the urgent report would have been that Naruto had escaped, somehow busted through a window and dropped 3 stories to the ground, they said, and none of the staff had been able to locate him, despite their large numbers. Holding her head in her hands, Tsunade tried to get a grip on herself. "Send Hitaki Kakashi to find him." "Yes, ma'am," the man had said, leaving the room. It was dark now, and it had been dusk when the report had been given to her. She suddenly became aware of just how heavy her own damn head could be. She couldn't find the energy to care anyways. Tears welled up in her already puffy, bloodshot eyes as she looked to the darkening night. Staring at the inky blackness for only a moment longer, she let her head slump back into her waiting hands. She didn't want anyone who happened to walk in to see she was crying. Naruto had been running for more than several hours now, darting around the whole village, always on his toes and of course, somehow turning around corners at just the right moment. And it was all in the hopes to simply get away from the staff that was looking frantically for him. Later that evening he would wonder why he hadn't just used chakra to disguise himself. Blaming it on a brain fart of sorts, he dismissed his moment of stupidity and went on with the rest of his life, as we all do. Actually, he was quite amazed by the sheer number of rehab workers that had been looking for him. All of them had been running around with their little name tags on, making them that much easier to spot. He was pretty sure had he not been trained in the ways of the ninja, they would have been able to spot him within a few minutes. That was how many there were. And what was even worse, they seemed to multiply by the minute, springing up like daisies in springtime. His legs burned something horrible and his lungs seemed to be trying to make their way up his throat, but he was pretty sure no one from that rehab center would be able to find him where he was now. Particularly because he was in a rather dense part of the forests that surrounded one of the less used training grounds. The fact that it was 2 hours into nighttime also helped in the conclusion he finally came to. Thinking on just exactly what he had done, he sat down with a sigh, realizing all over again just how dumb his move had been. He was pretty sure they'd keep him in there now for much longer than a month, as his original plan had not included at all. The plan, as he called it, had been to act like a civil and completely sane person and manage to get the hell out of the rehab center in a few weeks. But everyone knows civil and completely sane people don't just mouth off to a woman who hadn't done anything to them, in front of other people anyways, and then smash through a window and land 3 stories below after jumping through said window. He didn't have many options anymore, let alone options that would make sure he ended up ahead of the game. He could, A. go back and say he was sorry, B. leave the village or, circa stay in the forest. He knew they being the rehab center, would eventually get tired of looking for him and might even ask a ninja to find him, so staying in the forest wouldn't do much good for him. Neither would leaving, that could only make things 100 times worse. You really can't pull off the civil insane card when you decide to do all of the insane things mentioned above and then go AWOL to boot. So, all he was left with was running back with his tail between his legs and hope the stupid people would forgive his sorry excuse for an ass. Lying on the grass, Naruto enjoyed the cool air for several minutes, deeply breathing in the heavy night breeze. He knew he would not be able to do this for a while after he went back. Isolated and locked up places tended to have stale air, or so he'd heard. The cool air soothed his poor lunges, and the grass on the ground tickled his sore legs through his pants. Stretching his arms out to either side of himself, Naruto let himself truly relax for the first time in several days. He slowly let the scent of the earth wash over him, let it calm his still racing thoughts, let it bring them back down from their high-speed race. Staring up at what little of the sky he could see through the heavy foliage, he raised up both of his arms and made to grasp at the tiny stars. None too surprisingly, all he caught was air. Breathing deeply once more, he gingerly rested his still injured arms on his chest. He solemnly wished, for the second time in the same day, that the ground would somehow come to life and swallow him whole. Oh, how nice that would be. Hello, my little monster. His feigned paradise evaporated at the very sound of that voice. Practically flying off the ground, Naruto tried to shoot off into the forest, away from that voice, away from that man. But something grabbed a hold of his injured arm, digging the glass that had been there all day deeper into the wounds, blood flow starting anew. The something, which turned out to be a very strong hand, held his arm tight and twisted until he was nothing but a screaming pile of body on the ground. The hand left his arm, pulling him up by his shirt and pushing him harshly up against the body of a tree, holding him there tightly. Closing his eyes, Naruto tried to settle and hopefully keep his heart from jumping right out of his chest, it was pounding so frantically. Adrenaline pumping through his veins and body shaking with fear, he could feel the man's sickening warm breath on his face. It sent shivers up and down his spine so violently that it honestly hurt. "Are you scared, little monster?" the man whispered in his ear. Naruto squirmed as he felt the heat and slickness of a tongue trail over his cheek to the corner of his mouth where it then silently retreated. A whimper accompanied the squirming as a soft kiss was placed on the top of his brow, nearly bringing tears to Naruto's eyes. He could deal with people hitting him, calling him words, names of all kinds. But kindness being used as a weapon was something he would never understand how to deal with. Never. And no, I am not afraid. Naruto stammered, his eyes still shut tight. Of course, he was lying. He knew it, he knew the man knew it, hell, he couldn't even form a proper sentence, he was so damn scared. He was shaking like a leaf, he was whimpering and trying to squirm away from this man's grasp, and he was pretty sure the shinobi, the man, could hear his stupid heartbeat. As it was, the shinobi was probably close enough to feel the damn organ nearly go into arrest. Naruto could hear the man chuckle that haunting chuckle of his and he whimpered again. His squirming and struggling became even fiercer as lips crushed against lips, a tongue pushing its way into the other mouth for an unwanted entry. Moaning it to the kiss, Naruto was filled with disgust at his own natural reaction to what should have been, but was not, consensual contact. As his mind was bombarded with smells, tastes, and sounds he'd rather forget forever, he took action. Whether it had been instinct or some other sick, sadistic, revenge-seeking part of his mind surfacing for a second, Naruto would never know. He felt the man go rigid for a moment in surprise as Naruto pulled the man's face in further to his. The man's tongue and his own mingling together in his mouth for a moment before Naruto pulled his own tongue farther back into his mouth and bit down with all his might on the other's tongue. The man pulled back with a small surprised yelp, blood dripping out of his mouth, the very tip of his tongue now gone. He smiled insanely at the quickly retreating back of the blonde. "You can run all you want, my little monster, but I'm the one who knows what you fear most," the shinobi whispered to the night sky. Leaping into the trees, the shinobi was quick to find his way back to his home in the village. It wasn't until a quarter mile or so later when he ran head-on into a tree that Naruto realized he still hadn't opened his eyes yet. Naruto couldn't help but spit every few minutes as he walked closer and closer to the edge of the forest. He knew all of the man's blood and tiny bit of tongue in his mouth was long gone now. Still, the mere thought of a part of that man being inside him made his stomach churn. Naruto had accidentally forgotten that letting thoughts like that linger for too long in his head did more bad than good to his poor mind. And for his stomach as well. Crouching down to the ground, Naruto had just enough time to brace himself as his stomach began dry heaving. It took his poor body several times before it managed to bring up anything more identifiable than foamy bile. He welcomed the bitter flavor of it, the raw burn the acid left in his mouth, to him, felt 100 times better than the iron flavor that had coated his mouth moments ago. Coughing harshly as his body's natural gag reflex toward such memories subsided, Naruto placed his fingers in his mouth. This time he forced his throat to gag, painfully aware of his nose beginning to run as fluids from his stomach and intestines lodged themselves in his sinuses. Again and again he forced his body to give up everything it possibly could. Really, it didn't matter to him that his chest and throat burned. It didn't matter that his mouth felt like it was coated in sewage. Or that his nose dripped. Or that tears pooled from his eyes. It didn't matter that he felt so dizzy and lightheaded that he honestly considered lying down in the mess he had just made and fall asleep. What did matter, though, was how clean his insides suddenly felt. It was like someone had taken a scrub brush and scrubbed at his intestines and other organs alike. He was empty, he was clean. That was what mattered. Standing up and drying his tearing eyes, Naruto wiped off his mouth and fingers and walked away from the poor tree roots he had so unceremoniously up-chucked onto. He sniffled a bit as the taste of the acid made its way into his nose a second time. That was the only real thing he hated about this particular method of self-harm he indulged in when the times called for it. Now on the declining part of the hill that will be used as the analogy for his energy, Naruto's mind began to wander to the most ridiculous of things. Some of these things included many thoughts on tadpoles, why women even bothered to wear thongs, and of course, the obligatory, "I'm very sleepy," sentence that came into being between every other random thought he had. As Naruto's mind wandered, so did his body, almost of its own accord. Instead of making a beeline back to the center like he had planned when his mind had been far more coherent, he was now making something very similar to a random zigzagging trail in the outskirts of the training grounds. Eventually, his body came to the understanding that it had lost some important contact signal with the brain for the time being. So, instead of continuing, it promptly plopped itself down on the ground outside of a house that it would recognize, that is, if bodies had a psyche all their own. So, whilst his mind wandered still and his body gave up on wandering, Naruto just so happened to have plopped down in the backyard of the Nara clan's abode. Slowly, but surely, Naruto's mind stopped its wandering and focused where his legs had taken him. He stared at the first-story window with its light still on, even at such a late hour. Naruto could easily see Shikamaru quietly reading some book at his small desk, his baggy night clothes and hair loose from a ponytail showing just how relaxed he was. A moment or so later, Shikamaru looked up from his book, through the window, and let his eyes meet with Naruto's. At this point, Naruto's mind had fully recuperated from its little stay in La La Land and was harshly thrown back into reality as he realized Shikamaru had moved from his desk, opened the window and was calling to him. "Naruto, what are you doing here?" "Taking a walk," Naruto called back, his voice traveling over the several yards that separated them. Shikamaru motioned for Naruto to come to the window. A perplexed look could be seen clearly on his face as Naruto drew nearer to the window. "What do you mean you're taking a walk?" Shikamaru said. "Like I said, I'm just walking," Naruto said rather bluntly, not in any mood to try and deal with an over-analytic friend. Shikamaru stared at him for one moment longer before uttering a simple and effective, "Troublesome," before turning away from the still open window. "Hey, I'm not troublesome," Naruto retorted enthusiastically as he stuck his head into Shikamaru's room. "And you call sitting in my backyard at 12 in the morning being not troublesome?" Naruto had to admit, it was pretty late to be sitting in anybody's backyard. "Come on, it wasn't that much of a bother," Naruto said, never letting on just how exhausted he was. "It would have been a big deal if either of my mom or dad were home. They hate it when people get near our land at suspicious hours." "Well, where the heck are they?" Naruto said as he leaned his elbows against the window sill, propping his hands into them. "My dad's on some sort of recon mission and my mom's taking care of her sick sister on the other side of the village. Can't be too bad having the house to yourself for a while, right?" Naruto grinned. Shikamaru stared at him for another moment before asking, "You want to come in for a while?" "Huh?" was the only answer he got. "The house has been too quiet without mom around yelling about something every 5 minutes. I need someone who makes twice as much ruckus as her to make up for it." "I'm not noisy," Naruto said loudly as he let himself in through the window, making sure to close it behind him. Having locked the window tightly, Naruto turned to face Shikamaru. The boy had made his way to the open doorway of his room, where he seemed to have paused, now looking at some point just below Naruto's shoulders. "What, Shikamaru, do I have something on me?" Naruto meant it only as small talk, a little jab at humor and lightheartedness if you will. But of course, humor was never really Shikamaru's strong point. "Yeah, there's dried blood on your sleeves. What happened?" It was true. There was a good amount of dried blood caked onto the long sleeves that covered Naruto's arms. It seemed to be that he had mostly forgotten about the pain from the broken glass in his arms hours ago and hadn't noticed how much blood had actually been spilled. Dark, odd-colored areas mismatched the shirt, like oil spilled in water that spread out to make a varying array of shades of red-brown. Well, about that, nothing really." Naruto trailed off with a chuckle, desperately trying to come up with a plausible answer other than, "Oh, I jumped through a window and got glass shoved into my skin." Caught off guard, put on the spot, and suddenly asked to think extremely quickly on his feet, Naruto wasn't able to process the fact fast enough that maybe, just maybe, he shouldn't let Shikamaru see what was under his sleeves. All things that had led up to where he was at that point left him in a very desperate situation. He hadn't activated the jutsu to cover his own self-inflicted scars, now had he? And so, when Shikamaru had walked quickly up to him, muttering, "Don't be stubborn, it'll get infected if you don't treat it, you idiot," he had been able to easily pull up Naruto's left sleeve with only a half-thought-out struggle against said action. Needless to say, what he saw was more than borderline disturbing. It wasn't the cuts with bits of glass still stuck in them that caused the shock. The shock came from the scars that couldn't be accounted for, the ones Shikamaru had never seen before. It was the ones that Shikamaru knew weren't there the last time he'd seen Naruto, the ones that had never been there before. Underneath the tiny layer of dried blood, underneath that thin veneer, he could see them. In some places it looked as if there was no rhyme or reason to any of it. The scars were so sporadically placed across the skin. But then in other places, in other spaces of flesh, they were lined up like marching soldiers from faraway countries Shikamaru had only ever heard of. All made to look like neat little rows that walked hand in hand. There were old faded ones that had lost their impact on the eye with time, but the newer ones were a different story. Those were the ones that were still red, still looked raw. They were the ones you could still almost taste the raw agony from, could still hear the scream they might have caused. And the newest of them, all sewn up and stitched back together, was still red and irritated, especially now that some parts of it had been torn open again from the glass. A second or two was all Shikamaru had needed to discover what Naruto had kept hidden from everybody he'd ever known. It wasn't until Naruto tugged his arm back to himself that second or two later did Shikamaru actually let it all sink in. Naruto's face flushed in shame and embarrassment, the pit of his stomach dropped out. How could something that he had deemed safe, peaceful waters to tread in, how had it turned into yet another person discovering his coping mechanism? There was nothing he could do about this, No way to hide it now. Shikamaru knew, and there was no way he could take that knowledge back from him. You weren't supposed to see? Naruto trailed off, holding his once again concealed arm close to his chest, head downcast. The silence stretched out before them, stretched to the point where it was painfully uncomfortable. Swallowing his barley concealed fear, Naruto opened his mouth to break that painful silence. Naruto began, but was immediately interrupted. I used to have an older cousin that did that sort of thing. Shikamaru mumbled, gesturing to Naruto's arms. What happened to him? Naruto asked, not quite sure how to handle such a reaction. The silence was almost stretching itself out again before Shikamaru answered. Well, I heard he killed himself not too long ago. The conversation had gone from simply confusing to downright awkward, hitting it 10 out of 10 on the awkward-o-meter. Oh, was all Naruto managed to say. Would you like some tea? Shikamaru said suddenly as he lifted his head to meet Naruto's own stunned orbs. Again, this wasn't quite what Naruto had been expecting from Shikamaru. A quiet, get out, or banter of questions would have been under the understandable reaction category. But to hear a confession of family issues and an invitation to midnight tea? Now that threw Naruto for several intricate loops all at the same time. Sure, was all the now highly confused boy could manage. I'll clean those cuts for you too, Shikamaru said as he stepped out his bedroom. The heavy, receding footfalls that could eventually be heard told Naruto he was heading down the hall. Naruto stood there for a few moments collecting his wits, took one shaky breath, and headed out of the room. His legs were like jelly and it felt as if his stomach had lost its bottom. His head hurt, his eyes stung, and, if possible, he felt even more tired than before. He made his way down the hall and into the dining room where he sat down at the table where a white box was innocently sitting. Naruto stuck his tongue out at said box in simple amusement. He knew all too well what a first aid kit looked like. From the kitchen came Shikamaru, who now had an odd emotion swimming with the normal calm in his eyes. Naruto could see it was a mixture of fear, sadness with a hint of pity and a pinch of anger, all mixed into a nice muddy consistency. Naruto sighed to himself. He wished people would stop making such a big deal out of something that really wasn't all so bad. Let me see your arms for a second, Shikamaru said as he pulled a chair up next to Naruto, sitting in it. Instinctively, Naruto hesitated for a moment before he slowly let his scarred flesh be exposed to pondering eyes. A moment passed, and so did the impulse. If Shikamaru already knew they existed, it was pointless to try and hide them anyways. Slowly rolling up his sleeves, he watched as Shikamaru opened the white box and pull out a pair of tweezers, gauze and antiseptics. Naruto sat there numbly as Shikamaru gently pulled the remaining pieces of glass out of the wounds on his arms, placing the bloodied glass to the side. Dabbing antiseptics onto several cotton balls, Shikamaru muttered, "This is going to sting a little bit." As Shikamaru dabbed the damp fluff onto his cuts, Naruto did in fact feel a sharp twinge of pain, a low hiss its product. Shikamaru went through half of the bag of cotton balls and a quarter of the giant container of rubbing alcohol before all the cuts were finally rid of caked on blood and dirt. As white gauze covered the now far less bloody cuts, Naruto could see something else, completely new emotion swimming in his friend's eyes. He'd seen the same emotion overdramatized in one of the soap operas Sakura had forced him and Sasuke to watch when they'd had a team dinner, or as Kakashi put it, learning to tolerate each other is best done over a hot plate of food, at her house. He recognized it as the, let's have a nice chat about your issues look. Great, just fucking great. As the white box was closed again, gauze and other things put back into it, Naruto tried to brace himself for what was bound to come. And come it did. Naruto, Shikamaru began, before he was rather rudely interrupted by the sound of the kettle whistling. Growling underneath his breath, Shikamaru stood up from where he was sitting and walked back into the kitchen. Laying his head down, Naruto closed his eyes with a relieved sigh, unable to keep them open any longer. He was so damn tired. When Shikamaru walked back into the dining room with the 2 cups of happily steaming tea, he couldn't help a small smile find its way to his lips when he found Naruto fast asleep at the table. A knock at the door had Shikamaru wondering just how possibly weird this night could get. I would have never thought he'd come here, Kakashi Hitaki said to himself. He couldn't believe this was happening, Well, he had to simply because it was the reality of the situation. But still, this was a stretch, even for reality. Who'd have thought he, Kakashi Hitaki, would be trying to find Naruto so he could bring him back to a nut house? Who'd have thought it'd be possible for one of the brightest and, seemingly, happiest people he'd ever met to wind up in a place like that? But then again, no one would have suspected the same from Obito when he had been sent there. He couldn't help thinking it, but at times Naruto reminded him of Obito. He had a tendency to stumble in life and often complained about the lack of action his current position in the ninja world allotted him, just like Obito had constantly nagged. Now he could clearly see just how similar they were. Especially when Naruto's position reminded him so much of Obito's when he had been alive. It was dangerously close to being painful for him to watch what seemed to be history repeating itself. When Sasuke had told him what he had found when he'd gone to Naruto's apartment, Kakashi had told him not to tell a soul. No, not even Sakura. Soon after the rather short conversation with the slightly frazzled Uchiha, he had rushed over to the hospital Sasuke had taken Naruto to. It had been easy enough to find the doctor that had treated his student. That was, after he'd adamantly demanded the poor woman behind the desk that he see him. He didn't like to think too fiercely on what the educated man had told him. He didn't like to think on it one bit. He knew self-harm wasn't just a half-ass attempt at suicide. He knew that self-harm and suicide are two completely different beasts. They can't just be simultaneously replace one or the other. He knew the doctor had said that this habit of Naruto's had started years earlier. Much sooner than he'd ever come face to face with the boy. But still, the awful, encroaching thoughts lingered in the back of his mind. Were some of those scars there because of him? Had he at any point stepped over a line he shouldn't have? Had he ever accidentally sent Naruto closer to an invisible edge? Were the reasons for it all anything he could have stopped or fixed or even simply just made better? All these questions had been eating away at him since he'd had his word with the doctor. As sad as it was, the only thing that soothed his mind at all was the feeble thought that there was nothing he could have done for something he didn't know about. And yet, there was always another part of him would speak in the back of his mind, telling him, "You should have known though, you should have." And then he'd be back where he started. It was such a vicious cycle. Walking with an intended lazy stride, Kakashi walked to the door of the Nara residence, knocked loudly and waited for one of the two people he knew who were inside to answer. A moment after he had knocked, Kakashi found the door being opened by none other than a very surprised Shikamaru. "Are you taking a midnight walk as well, Hitaki-san?" Shikamaru asked him, smiling at his own words. Kakashi assumed it must have been some sort of inside joke, because really, who took midnight strolls and stopped to wake someone up? "Sorry to disappoint, but I'm not up and about for my own pleasure. I'm here to pick up your little visitor." At this, the door opened wider and Kakashi stepped into the youth's home. "He's asleep at the table," Shikamaru stated quietly. Nodding, Kakashi made his way to the dining room table to find a very much asleep Naruto. Shaking him slightly, Kakashi tried to jar his student awake, but was only able to get a murmur out of the blonde that sounded distinctively like gibberish. Smiling at the ramblings of Naruto's obviously very sleepy mind, Kakashi picked the boy up and made his way back to the still open front door. "Before you leave, would you mind telling me what exactly is going on?" Shikamaru said, nodding his head towards the sleeping body in the older man's arms. "There's not much to tell, Shikamaru. Unless he's told you what's going on himself, I'm not sure I'm at liberty to discuss his personal happenings. I'm aware of what's happening, Hitaki-san. Please, don't treat me like I'm not able to handle something like a friend who cuts their own flesh." Always a sharp one, Shikamaru was. At the moment, Kakashi didn't want to try and weasel out of him exactly how he already knew about the situation. Kakashi had more important things to deal with. "Since you already know so much, you should know he'll be staying at the Happy Hills Rehabilitation Center until further notice." "I see. When he wakes up, will you please reassure him that I won't tell anyone?" To this, Kakashi simply nodded. Turning to the door yet again, Kakashi made his leave. The center wasn't ridiculously far away, making Kakashi's travels short and sweet. Looking up at the fairly old building, Kakashi felt a huge bubble of bitter nostalgia rise up in him, wanting desperately to burst. The few times he had visited here during Obito's stay had not gone well. Almost unwillingly he remembered in sudden clarity how, despite all of his skills at keeping a straight face, He had nearly exploded at Obito for attempting something as selfish and as stupid as suicide. He'd already tasted the stagnant flavor that never goes away from life once someone you knew had prematurely stopped their own heart. But, thankfully, Rin's steady gaze had kept his building anger at bay until he was able to leave the building. Leave before he flung unnecessarily cruel words onto an already downtrodden teammate. Walking into the dark building, Kakashi was amazed, even years after his first visits, that the building never seemed to ever get robbed. With them leaving the door unlocked and all, he would have expected it to happen more often than not. But from what he understood, they had never had to lock the doors. No one seemed to think the building had much worth to steal anyways. Walking slowly up the stairs, Kakashi wondered if the third-floor waiting room looked the same as it had years ago. Reaching the third-floor landing, Kakashi managed to open the door without much difficulty and let himself in. Since the lights were dimmed to a mere soft glow, Kakashi had to let his eye adjust for a moment as he looked around the room. It had the same old chairs, same wall color, same plastic plant in the corner of the room, and same old desk. The only difference in the room at all was the person napping behind the desk. "Hello?" he said uncertainly to the young woman slumped over the desk. At his single word, her head shot up and for a moment she blinked sleepily at him. Slowly, she smiled. "Hitaki-san, thanks for bringing him back, I got so worried," the woman said in a voice laced with childishness. She quietly clambered to her feet, stretching as she did. Not wanting to know exactly how or why she knew his family name, he turned his attention to rousing Naruto from his exhausted sleep. Shaking him gently, Kakashi managed to get him to wake. "What is it?" Naruto asked, sleep dripping in his voice. His movements were sluggish as Kakashi let him down out of his arms. Walking over to one of the old, plastic chairs, Naruto plopped down and proceeded to try to fall back asleep. "Naruto," Kakashi said, slightly loud. Blue eyes blinking open, Naruto stared at his teacher for a moment in the dim light, saying, "Kakashi-sensei, what are you doing in Shikamaru's house?" "Naruto, we're back at the center. You fell asleep, remember? I was told that I needed to find you and bring you back here," Kakashi answered. Staring at him for a moment or two, Naruto couldn't help the, "Ah crap," that escaped his lips. "Kiriva has to go to the potty," the woman, Kiriva, said. "You're still here?" Naruto asked in a slightly desperate attempt to change the subject, head snapping to where Kiriva was already halfway out of the door. "Yup, you can call me the epitome of the hard worker," Kiriva said with a small smile on her face as she trudged out of the room to find a potty. A silence filled the room for a few agonizingly long moments before either of them broke it. "Kakashi-sensei, can we talk about this some other time? I can barely keep my eyes open and I can't think all too straight," Naruto said. It was very true that his eyes were quite tired. "Sasuke told me what happened. I bumped into him after he had dropped you off at the hospital. He told me it looked like you had tried to kill yourself," Kakashi said, watching Naruto intently. "Sasuke doesn't know worth shit," Naruto answered glumly, quite agitated with how the whole day had gone. "I also talked to that doctor who took care of you. Satoshi? What did he have to say?" "Well, he said it wasn't a suicide attempt." "Ha, I told you Sasuke doesn't know a thing. But he did tell me that you'd been doing this for over 4 years. He said the number of scars you have and how old some of them were gave that much away," Kakashi said, almost disregarding what Naruto had said about Sasuke. A heartbeat, a moment, and Naruto ended the conversation. "Please leave Kakashi-sensei, I don't want to talk about this at 1 in the morning. I don't want to talk about it at all right now." Another moment, another heartbeat, and Kakashi caved in. "I'll come back in 2 days, can you talk then?" "Maybe, but maybe not. We'll have to see when we get there," Naruto said in a barley there whisper with his head resting downcast in his hand. "Good night Naruto." "Night Kakashi-sensei." A minute or so later, Kiriva came tiptoeing back into the room, Naruto's eyes following her every step. "How'd your wee little talk go?" she asked in a whisper. "He gave me 2 days before we're to talk," Naruto answered as he stood up to follow her. Walking back down the hallway he had walked down not but a few hours ago, Naruto was about to protest when they passed the door they'd initially gone through. "Wasn't I? Oh, you got moved up 4 sections because of that window thingy you did today. It's not a problem, they'll fix the window Naruto, so don't you worry. The Board of Medicine just didn't look at your case hard enough." After a few hours ago, they had a super emergency meeting to decide what level you should be put on. Kirova explained as they continued walking. As they continued walking, Naruto thought of something that struck him as extremely odd about Kirova. How do you know my name? I haven't met you before, right? Looking at him as she plugged in the code to the lock on the last door of the hall, she smiled and said, Kirova is odd and she knows it. It is one of my oddities that I have. Almost everyone I meet I've felt like I've met before, even if I haven't. You're still young and may not understand it yet, but that is how I am and how I will always be. The door opened with the sounds of several low clicks and whirls, and Kirova opened the door wide, letting Naruto step in first and then herself before leaving the door just a bit open. Why not close it? Naruto asked in a whisper, pointing to the door and its menacing-looking lock. Kirova knows how to get in, but not how to get out. I'm good with names, but numbers seem to flee from my brain like it's a disease. She whispered, scratching the back of her head sheepishly. Continuing their way down the floor, Naruto found it to look almost exactly like the one he'd seen earlier in the day, with the exception of thick bars on each window and a different pattern to the tiled floor. Kirova, a middle-aged woman, hissed in a low whisper as she came trotting down the hall. What is it? What is the matter? Kirova asked the other woman. It's Emiko, I can't find her anywhere. The woman said frantically, nearly in hysterics. Calm down. We'll look for her, no worries. Have you looked in her normal hiding places? Kirova said calmly, her naturally childish voice clashing with the tone. Out of the corners of his eyes, Naruto saw a figure dart towards where he knew an open door lay. And as Kirova continued to calm the woman down, Naruto too snuck back the way he'd came from. Door now wide open, Naruto followed the dark figure as it left the third floor and walked quickly up the stairs. You're calm now, yes? Kirova asked the woman, who nodded her head. Kirova, did the bathrooms get moved? I can't seem to find them at this very second in time. Another voice asked as its owner came down the hallway. She was clad in slippers, sweatshirt and night pants, long white hair done up in a loose bun, red eyes glazed with sleep, fairly pale skin gleaming in the dim hall lights. Oh Miyuki, Emiko got lost and I still had to get this other one settled. Kirova said, exasperated. What other one? Miyuki asked, looking behind the older woman's shoulder. This one right behind. Kirova turned, only to realize Naruto was now gone. Did you lose them? Miyuki asked. Kirova nodded her head dumbly. Want some help? I don't think she'll be much use. Miyuki said, nodding to the puffy-eyed woman who tried but failed to stare meanly at her. Do you promise on a most sacred of pinky swears that if I let you go check up on the roof you'll come back? Kirova asked, sticking out her right pinky finger. Rolling her eyes in mock annoyance, the girl wrapped her own pale pinky around the already outstretched one. You're one of the few people I actually like in here, Kirova. Of course I'll come right back, the white-haired girl said. Uncurling her finger from the other, the girl named Miyuki found her way to the stairs, jogging up them as she went. For some dumb reason, she had the distinct feeling of already being too late to stop something from starting. Shrugging the feeling off, she continued to climb the last flight of stairs. Naruto crept up the stairs after the figure, very much aware they were headed towards the roof. As he made it to the top, Naruto quickly searched the rooftop for the lone figure. He could clearly see the tall link chain fences and most other accessories one would expect to on top of a roof. That is, except for the lone figure he finally spotted. Naruto watched silently as the young woman in her torn jeans and black tank top climbed over the fencing that surrounded the roof, eventually lowering herself to the edge of the other side. She turned to face the edge of the building, held tightly onto the chain link wire of the fence and leaned forward. He could see her stare off at the quiet darkness of the city, letting her long black hair blow with the wind. Hey, Naruto said loudly as he made his way toward where she stood. The young woman simply glanced at him and then back at the ground. What do you want, kid? The young woman said after another moment. Nothing really. Naruto answered nonchalantly. Yeah right, everyone wants something. You want to be a hero and say you saved me from my biggest mistake? Forget it, kid. I can't go back now, not when I'm this close. Just one little step and this whole, ugly nightmare can finally stop for me. The young woman said, bitterness dripping in her voice. Stepping close enough that he could make out goosebumps on her arms from the chilly weather and the few scars that accompanied them, Naruto spoke. Can I ask you something? What? She said, bitterness in her voice increased. Can you tell me your name? The young woman turned her head to stare at him and then turned to face him completely, hands still clutching the fencing. Why do you want that? She asked, suspicion now nearly drowning out the bitterness in her voice. So someone can remember you when you're gone. I'm not going to try and stop you. I've been where you are right now a handful of times myself. I haven't been able to actually be greeted by death yet, but you seem pretty damn determined to do just that. Call it dumb, but I don't want you leaving the world without at least someone remembering your name for some time. It'd be just too damn sad if I had to watch you die and never even knew your name. Naruto said, shrugging. The lady stared at him for a moment. Naruto couldn't tell exactly what the expression on her face was. One second it looked like she might cry, the next like she might scream. And then suddenly, she was fumbling with something on her neck. Yanking whatever it was over her head, she shoved her hand through one of the holes the wire fencing made, wiggling it for Naruto to take. You talk too much, but I'll give you my name and something to keep your mind from forgetting me. She said, dropping a beautiful glass ring with a string loop through it into Naruto's hand. Hey, she said, dragging Naruto's attention away from the delicate ring in his palm. That's mine and my mom's ring. Take care of it for me, okay? My name, by the way, is Emiko Nanase. She said, staring at him for only a moment before letting herself fall back, away from the building and closer to death. A second later, a rather loud crunch told him when Emiko had become only a person in his memories. Naruto knew you could or couldn't die from falling from 4 stories high. To live, land on your feet, to die, land on your head. Anywhere in between and you might not get what you want. But Naruto had a feeling she'd been someone who'd make sure to dive in head first, just to see what would happen. Naruto stood there for some time, just staring at where she had been and holding the ring in his hand. Hey, a soft voice said as a hand landed on his shoulder. What happened? The hand belonged to a girl who was only an inch taller than him, long white hair and pale skin that glowing softly in the autumn moonlight, and blazing red eyes. For a moment, in his dazed and tired mind, he thought he was looking at an earthen spirit. She died, Naruto said, walking back into the building, the white-haired girl trailing after him. As Naruto slipped into bed, clothes and all, he removed the necklace Tsunade had given him not but 3 months before. Untying its ends, he strung the thin glass ring Emiko had given him onto the black string and tied back onto his neck once more. There was no way Naruto would be able to forget Emiko Nanase for a very long time. Naruto wouldn't call himself a light sleeper, but even he had to admit that this whole waking up every 30 or 40 minutes by every little bump in the night was starting to get just plain stupid. After the 4th time this had happened, Naruto huffed irritably, got out of bed, and decided then and there to go to the bathroom. With his feet padding down the dim halls, Naruto was only stopped once by the woman he had seen earlier that late evening or very early morning, whichever you think would be correct. What are you doing up this early? I'm going to the bathroom, you know, to pee? Naruto said bluntly, wishing he would have just managed to stay asleep. She studied his face for a moment longer before giving him an answer. I'll be checking on the boys' dorm room in 7 minutes. If I find a bed empty, I'm going to assume it's you. With that, she strolled away, leaving Naruto a little more than annoyed. He didn't like having a time limit on his bathroom time. Not one bit. Walking into the bright room, Naruto had to squint for a few seconds before his eyes adjusted to the light. Meandering over to the small rows of sinks on the far side of the room, the entrance to the showers were at the opposite end, Naruto stared at himself in the cloudy mirrors. Seeing for the first time in hours what everyone else had seen when they looked at him, he couldn't help but smile to himself. His hair looked like a tornado had attacked it, what with its tangled and messed up locks poking every which way from his skull more so than normal, mud and sticks tagging along. His face looked like someone had come and beaten it with some sort of ugly stick. It wore a disgusting coat of dried sweat that shined sickly in the light, dried dirt and a small amount of blood accompanying it. To top it all off, his eyes were slightly bloodshot, now with fairly light but defined bags underneath them, and cracking lips finished his unintended imitation of the living dead. Turning the cold faucet of the sink on and catching the water in cupped hands, he splashed and vigorously rubbed it onto his face, shaking the excess off like a dog. Running his fingers through his hair a few times, pulling out the tangles and mud and sticks and other debris, he took a moment to look at his ruined clothes. Spots on the sleeves where blood had dried, earth staining his appearance, particularly on his back when he took the moment to take a look at it from when he had been lying on the ground. From when he'd been taking a break and grasping for the stars. Before that man had come and had. He didn't want to think about it, but his hand instinctively flew to his lips at the thought of what had happened earlier, unaware of the fact that he had already begun to scratch at them as if there was grim caked into the very skin. Turning the sink's hot water on as far as it would go, Naruto cupped the steaming water into his hands and shoved it into his mouth, gargling and sloshing it around despite the pain that shot through his mouth from such heat. He did this, again and again, until he was positive that anything left of that man in his mouth had been burned away. It might hurt for a while, but Naruto knew he was much more capable of handling a burnt mouth than anything else. Hands gripping the side of the sink, he focused on his reflection, hoping this moment would pass quickly, that he wouldn't have to remember anything. And, just as he had hoped, the moment did pass. The only thing that was left of the would have been impending flashback was the leftover sound of that awful man's voice whispering quietly. "Keep it a secret, little monster." And even then, the horrible echo was gone in a moment, and Naruto had won a small personal battle against himself, against his very mind. Sighing deeply and pushing himself away from the sinks, Naruto turned the faucet off and tiredly headed out of the bathroom, the thought of peeing now completely gone from his thoughts. "You're cutting it close. Another 20 seconds and I would have had to come look for you," the woman said pleasantly as he passed her by on the way to his room. He ignored her openly, deciding that trying to start any sort of argument this early in the morning was so not worth it. With these thoughts, he happily crawled into bed and promptly fell asleep. Sleep came easily then and stayed with him. That was, until he had to wake up to his first day of Happy Hills Rehabilitation Center. It's a world I don't know. One where the feeling to impress is not needed. Where hiding is both accepted and rejected. Where I'm free but happily caged. For once, I might actually feel safe. Safe enough to show who really is, me. Now, it might not be very fair to say that Naruto was not a morning person. Why, you find yourselves asking? That would be because, simply put, Naruto really didn't discriminate when it came to what time he liked being awake or asleep. When he fell asleep and when he woke up didn't matter to him. What did matter, however, was if he was woken up by someone else. Do that and he would already be in a fairly bad mood, no matter if he had rolled out on the right or wrong side of the bed. So, when a gentle hand calmly shook him awake, it would be fair to say that he was grumpy. If only slightly. "What do you want?" Naruto asked the person standing above him in his more than slightly grumpy voice, keeping his eyes shut. "It's time to get up, that's all," a kind voice said. When Naruto felt said person move away from his bed, he sat up in a very lethargic manner, rubbing the crust from his eyes and whatnot. Turning his head, he saw a boy, young man really, he didn't look younger than 16 or 17. Waking up the occupant in the bed next to his. The boy in the bed started, seeming to relax when he saw who was waking him up. Boy whom was doing the waking had shaggy, brown hair that was pulled to the nape of his neck in a short ponytail. When Naruto caught a glimpse of them, he took note that said young man had a distinct pair of warm green eyes. He was clad in a casual long-sleeved dark green shirt and similarly casual dark brown pants. Turning his attention away from the brow-haired boy to his blanket-covered feet, he collected his thoughts for a moment on what had happened within the last 24 hours. Ran away from the nut house by use of window jumping check. Accidentally revealing his issues to Shikamaru check. Found out that not only did Sasuke know where and why he was in a nut house, but Kakashi as well check. Got about 3.5 hours of sleep check. Well, all in all, things were looking fairly shitty at the moment, Naruto sarcastically surmised to himself. Showers up, an attending from the hallway called into the room. Naruto watched as some dashed out of the room at those words, while most moved sluggishly, obvious that they were still half asleep. Naruto too got out of his warm, comfortable sheets and found his bag that had been tossed into a corner near his bed. After rummaging through it for a moment or two, he emerged with fresh clothes and a towel. With these things in tow, he made his way to the showers he had seen the night before. Now, Naruto wasn't the richest person in the Konoha village, so when he saw that these showers had shampoo and body wash, both in bulk containers, he actually considered for a moment that this place couldn't be so bad if they made sure you washed with actual shampoo and actual body wash, Not just one of the old, not very comfortable bars of soap like he had to at home. Having taken a shower and changed in the stall, Naruto walked out of the bathroom, throwing the ruined bandages from the night before away and slinging on one of his orange coats that obviously did not have blood and the like on it. Entering the dorm-like room, he set off to make his bed, like any good person does. After doing just that, he looked for and eventually found the sheet of paper that would tell him the schedule he was to follow until he was released from the rehab center. Whenever that was going to happen, Naruto hadn't the slightest clue. His little sheet read something like this, its exactness making him frown slightly. 8 o'clock wake-up call. 8 o'clock to 8:15 morning wash-up. 8:15 to 8:35 breakfast. 8:35 to 9 o'clock morning exercise session. 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock first recreational time. 10 o'clock to 12:30 group therapy. 12:30 to 1 o'clock lunch. 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock art therapy. 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock one-on-one, patient and psychologist session. 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock music therapy. 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock second recreational time. 7 o'clock to 7:30 dinner time. 7:30 to 7:50 roll call. 7:50 to 8:20 evening shower. 8:20 to 9 o'clock room time. Time spent in your room before bed. 9 o'clock to 9:05 lights out. Folding the little paper and slipping it into his pocket, Naruto turned his attention to his slightly exposed arms. Sometimes, when he wasn't particularly crazed or upset, he would catch a glimpse of his scars and cringe. Sometimes, he couldn't help but see them as they really were, ugly things, reminders to the fact that he was a little off-kilter. Then the moment would pass and he would remember that those ugly things, those little reminders, were helping him keep his sanity intact. As cliché as it all sounded, his self-inflicted scars were both a bane and a salvation. He sighed to himself and began to make the hand seals for his own, personal, special jutsu. It was strong enough to hide hundreds of scars and any fresh cuts he may have done upon himself, yet simple enough that it took near to no chakra to activate its effects and keep it that way. Even unconscious, it would not stop working unless he himself released it. The only way for it to undo itself without his will was if he died. And at that point, anyone who saw them couldn't bring up any awkward questions or inquiries, now could they? Needless to say, this had saved his ass several times during the course of his ninja career. A grumbling in the back of his mind alerted him to the fact that the fox wished to say something, and Kyuubi would never talk to him if it wasn't absolutely important. Dropping his hands to his sides, Naruto twiddled his thumbs for a second before speaking inwardly. What is it? You haven't noticed it yet, have you? And what, might I ask, am I supposed to be noticing? The barrier that's around this building, of course. Naruto could almost feel the demon move around in his rusty cage for a moment and then settle back down onto the floor. Mind telling me what it does? Naruto said. It's a chakra-suppressing barrier, I can tell that much. I'm not too sure what it will do to you if you try and use chakra though. I wouldn't try it if I were you. You could end up hurting your body more than you usually like to. Naruto made an annoyed sound in the back of his throat, muttering obscene things about skulls and penises for a moment or two before he let himself emerge from the conversation back to reality. A reality that happened to be filled with people moseying out of the room. Following them down the halls barefooted, Naruto eventually found himself in what turned out to be a cafeteria, a line of people picking what they'd like for breakfast from the few choices they were given. His growling stomach reminded him that it hadn't been fed since yesterday morning. Getting in line, he was happy to find that the food looked far more edible than the hospitals had. Taking his food-laden tray, he stared at the rows of tables and benches, his stomach dropping just a tiny bit. He had no one to sit with, of course, and he wasn't about to go up to a complete and utter stranger and ask, I don't know anyone, could I sit with you? He didn't want to make it blatantly obvious that he was new to this whole thing. His head turned sharply as he felt a hand tap lightly on his coat-covered shoulder. That hand, when he followed it, turned out to belong to the girl he had seen last night. The pale girl who'd come after Emiko Nanase had done what she'd done, the one he had almost mistaken for some sort of angel. Same red eyes, white hair and pale skin, dressed in a simple black sweatshirt with the words, "Never Knows Best," scrawled on the front in silver marker and gray sweatpants. She gave him a tiny smile and asked, "You're new, right?" Naruto nodded his head numbly. "Well, come sit with me and my cousin. We don't bite, I promise," she said, tugging on the sleeve of his coat as she began walking. Naruto unknowingly followed her like some sort of lost puppy, weaving in and out of the rows of people at her lead. Sitting down next to her, Naruto recognized the boy sitting across from both of them as the one who had woken him up all but 30 minutes ago. Now, it may not seem possible, what with his exuberant personality and boisterous disposition, but Naruto was actually rather shy when it came to meeting new people. So, over the years he had developed many ways to try and secretly test people to see if they could even have the slightest chance of having friendly terms with one another. Then and there, he used one on the boy sitting across from him. "You know, you kind of remind me of my imaginary friend I had as a kid." He waited for a response, watching the brunette smile lightly. "Maybe I am, who's to say I'm not?" Naruto smiled broadly, listening happily to the white-haired girl next to him laugh like she hadn't laughed in her life, knowing well it was the reaction he was looking for. "My name is Arashi Akuma, nice to meet you." Arashi introduced himself, letting the sentence hang for Naruto to give his own name. "I'm Naruto Uzumaki, #1 ninja and your next Hokage." Naruto recited the introduction that he knew by heart. "And I," the white-haired girl said, finally able to control her laughter, "am Miyuki Akuma." "What are you in for, Naruto?" Naruto's body language spoke volumes of confusion at this question. "You know, what did you do to end up in here? Did you overdose, stick your fingers down your throat too much, starve yourself, take drugs, try to kill yourself? Or maybe you cut yourself too deeply and a friend found you?" Miyuki was talking to herself by the end of her questions, not intentionally ignoring Naruto's rather uncomfortable look. Arashi sighed and flicked his plastic spoon at his cousin's face, hitting the target dead on. "Ouch, why do you do that, Arashi? Don't be rude. Think for a moment, what if a stranger asked you that sort of thing?" Miyuki seemed to think about it for a moment before a look akin to that which had been on Naruto's face not but a few seconds ago blossomed onto her own. She turned to him at this point, regret easily discernible in her eyes. "I am so sorry," she said, articulating each and every guilt-dripping word. "It's okay," Naruto said simply. He was just happy they didn't actually expect him to answer the question. He turned back to his food for a moment, before Arashi asked him, "So, where do you have to go to next, Naruto?" Taking the piece of paper out of his pocket again, he read, 8:35 to 9 o'clock is exercising for me." Not catching the small look the cousins gave each other, Miyuki asked, "What's the rest of your schedule say?" Reading it off, he again failed to notice the small glances the two others threw at each other. Silence followed the few moments after Naruto had finished reading the schedule, in which he put the paper back into the pocket of his orange pants and sat somewhat awkwardly. "Coincidence?" Miyuki asked Arashi. "Maybe, but maybe not." He answered, What you guys are talking about?" Naruto asked, a bemused look passing over his face for the second time that morning. "You, my friend, happen to have the same schedule as both of us do," Miyuki said, sticking out her tongue in amusement. "One hell of a coincidence," Naruto replied, snorting sarcastically. "You can say that again," Arashi said, finishing up his food. "I'd say that's on hell of a," Naruto began again jokingly, but was interrupted by a soft punch to the shoulder, to which he of course acted like it was quite painful. "I'm sure he didn't mean it literally, screwball." "Hey, here, take my sweatshirt," Miyuki said, pulling the article of clothing off as she spoke. Naruto said, waiting for an explanation as to why she was basically stripping in front of him. "You don't really seem too happy with that coat showing off those cuts and scars of yours." "Give me that coat, a little neon orange never hurt anybody," she said, all but ripping the orange and blue jacket off the boy's back as she shoved her own into his hands. Standing up and pulling the coat on, with her black undershirt beneath said opened coat, Miyuki picked up her tray. At that moment, it was the first time Naruto ever caught a look at them. It was the first time he saw scars that were too linear to perfectly placed for them to be an accident. At least, on someone else's skin. There were pale and red and ragged scars that littered the small wrists in front of him. No obvious pattern could be seen in the to anyone but their owner. Naruto knew he stared for a moment too long before slipping on the sweatshirt he had been given on. He followed both the cousins as they headed out the door, striking up a conversation with Miyuki about one of the ideas that liked to pop up in his head every now and then. "Who do you think would win? Godzilla or King Kong?" he asked. "And who the hell is King Kong?" Miyuki asked. Smiling happily, he spent a good portion of their exercise time trying to explain to her who King Kong was, and why he thought Godzilla would surely kick his ass until it was raw. Well, I guess you could be right. But this Kong guy sounds a lot cooler than some giant, mutated lizard dude. Miyuki said, watching some of the other patients play a game involving a ball and some strange sort of maneuver that required one to tilt sideways, stumble a bit, make a weird gargling noise, spit on an opponent's foot and then fart or burp on the ball. As you could already tell, most if not all the players of this game were male. Hey, Miyuki said suddenly, want to play DDR? We have that here? Naruto asked, attention quite caught. Yeah, it's hooked up to this old game console that lets you play with it with this mat-like thing ma bob. Miyuki said, jumping to her feet and running to a corner of the room where one could see what looked like an old TV was set up. Naruto took his sweet time to mosey on over and was glad that by the time he did reach the other side of the room, Miyuki had it already set up. Want to compete with each other? I warn you, I am the undisputed champion of this little DDR game here. Miyuki said with a small hint of smugness in her voice, patting the old TV gingerly. It was almost like she was afraid it was so old that it might break if she even touched it too harshly. That, Arashi said as he plopped himself down on the ground behind where the two mats had been set up, would be because you are the only one in this section who has played that game more than 3 times before. Sticking her tongue at him, she turned her attention back to the screen, trying to choose which song she wanted to dance to. I think I'll be able to go as fast as you can go. Naruto said, choosing the correct level and then the same song as Miyuki. The game, in short, at one point or another turned itself into a small spectator sport as Naruto and Miyuki continued their tournament with the next song. It was truly a remarkable thing to watch. Both of their bodies moving at nearly the same time, never missing a beat. The speed they were going at made it look like it was a practiced routine dancing, making all onlookers think that such a thing could easily be achieved if practiced enough. And when it was time to leave, both Miyuki and Naruto had given all the people in the room something to talk about for the next couple of months, all wondering if they could ever do the same. Naruto's first recreational time was spent sleeping the hour away on a couch, body curled up into something similar to the fetal position. Arashi sat next to him, reading a book whose title slips the mind easily, and Miyuki next to him, a bright orange book in her hands with the title, Icha Icha Paradise, Yaoi Edition. Keep in mind, she simply ignored the warning on the back about how the book was in no way meant for peoples less than 18 years of age and continued reading happily about all the lovely butt schmecks that loaded the book. Now one thing was for sure about group therapy. Almost no one liked it. What was worse, it happened to be the longest activity of their day. It was awkward, scary, and tended to do more harm than good. More harm than good in the sense that fights often, if not always, occurred during group therapy because of the slightly different views on things they would discuss. Alright everyone, since we have a newcomer today, we're going to go around the room, give our names, ages, and birthdays. Naruto, would you begin first? My name is Naruto Uzumaki, I am 13 years old, and my birthday is October 10th. My name is Miyuki Akuma, I am 12 years old and will be 13 this coming October 31st. My name is Arashi Akuma, I am 14 years old, and my birthday is April 13th. Naruto almost started at this. Arashi was only a year older than he was and he'd mistaken the boy as being nearly 3 or 4 years his senior. Putting his thoughts aside, Naruto tried to pay attention as everyone within the semi-circle introduced themselves. Keyword being here tried. About halfway through these introductions however, his mind began to wander something fierce. As the conversation and discussion started up, Naruto couldn't help but notice how wonderful the tiled floor had instantaneously become, for the floor was by far more convincingly interesting than this group therapy stuff. What do you think, Naruto? The lady asked him suddenly. Naruto snapped out of his staring contest with the floor and asked. What do I think about what? What do you compare society to? A much older boy, though he could be wrong about that boy's age too, with a shaved head said. Naruto was silent for a moment, wondering if he should answer truthfully. After a moment, he decided he might as well. He was in a nut house, and no one had asked his opinion about something before. So why not give it a shot? A garden and a gardener. How come? Someone else asked. Well, Naruto began, I think society as we know it is like a garden for one simple reason. Even if the flowers and the weeds grow up together, the gardener only kills the weeds, the things not wanted. It's just like people. The pretty ones, the flowers, make fun of the ones who don't fit what they think is normal or correct. They make fun of the weeds. And most governments would probably like to lock up or get rid of every single weed they see, just so things would look nice. I'd really like to believe everyone in this world has a purpose other than to eventually die, but you never know with whatever higher beings that be might think. I think everyone has at least one thing to do before they go, but it's only the conceited flowers that think that they are the only ones who are going to do something with their lives, therefore everyone else should step down and give up. That's what I think, anyways. The room was quiet for a moment before someone asked solemnly, "We're the weeds, aren't we?" "Well, we are the ones stuck in a nut house," Naruto answered, going back to staring at the floor. Try as she might, the woman leader of the group could not start the conversation again after this point, for everyone was too deep in their own thoughts to care. By lunchtime, Naruto was pretty sure that he wasn't all too sure about this place. Yes, it was a nice oxymoron, thank you very much. The food was all right. The people, though not all, he wasn't too sure about yet, and he had yet to finish a whole day here. What you said at group was pretty intense, you know. Miyuki told him halfway through their lunch period. Naruto moved his food around his plate for a moment, thinking. Yeah, well it's pretty accurate, you know. At least, I think so. He said, thinking quickly for a less awkward topic. Is your birthday really on October 10th? Arashi asked, sipping at his small carton of milk. Wonderful. From awkward to severely uncomfortable in just a single leap and bound. Well yeah, why do you ask? No, I just thought it was interesting that you were born on the day this village's fourth Hokage killed the Kyuubi, that's all. You're like a historical child or something, Arashi said jokingly. Naruto laughed along with the other two, not knowing what else to do. They had no way of knowing the truth. How were they to know how much he disliked the date of his birth? Where do we go to next? Naruto asked, pushing aside any dark feelings that had been trying to stir in his chest. Art therapy I think, Miyuki said, belching in the most unladylike of ways. Naruto snorted a laugh as he ate the rest of his lunch, Miyuki showing him how she could fake burp and fake burp well, the loud belches attracting a few glances as the sound of laughter accompanied it. One thing that many people had gotten all wrong about Naruto was that he was in fact a very boastful person. He was pretty good at hiding this little tidbit about himself, along with hiding the fact that he was in any way shape or form sad or severely depressed. The thing was, when he would boast about things, he would so about things he didn't care people knowing or believing. Like that he would be the next Hokage. Or that he really enjoyed a good prank, which he did, just not as much as people would assume. What he didn't boast about, though, were things that he thought would break the wool he had been able to pull over people's eyes for so long. So instead of seeing a sometimes shy, depressed, artistic and fairly bright boy, they saw a loud, happy, if not a little bit on the dim side kid. He being artistic or smarter than he normally acted was just a few of the things he didn't boast about, even if the loud, happy, if not a little bit on the dim side kid, was a complete and utter bullshit lie. Alright everyone, the male teacher of sorts in the room began, you know what to do. If you'd like your CDs and CD players, I moved them to that corner over there. Why, you ask? Well, the inhabitants on top of my desk seem to have started a civil war amongst each other and have left a very dreadful mess. He finished, many heads turning to the corner in which the man's desk was located, most honestly surprised to see that it did look like a war had somehow broken out on his desktop. Portfolios with their art spilling out of them, random soda pop bottles standing in odd stacked forms, used tissues, coffee cups by the dozens, the chair to said desk missing 3 legs, several large boxes of opened band-aids and what looked like a very large stuffed dog. Everyone in the room couldn't help but wonder, who'd won? Now, who would like to choose the CD I'll put into the boombox today? The teacher asked. I will, Miyuki and one other girl said in unison, both running over the teacher to try and convince him that the other was completely the wrong one to choose, while, on the other hand, they were obviously the right choice to make. Needless to say, it seemed that a small yelling contest would erupt soon. And as said yelling contest was on the verge of starting, Naruto made his way to the few large crate boxes in which held patients' CD players and cases if they owned them. Why do they keep them in here? Naruto asked Arashi as they both stood in line waiting for their turn to find what was theirs. They think all of us are going to try and do something stupid with them. Like what? Naruto inquired, stepping a foot or two forward as the line moved. Swallow the pieces, hang ourselves with the cords, or cuts ourselves with the CDs if you break them in half. Given, all of those things have happened before. But you know, I don't really think anyone's that dim anymore to try something like it. Arashi said as he looked through the crates, eventually pulling out a bright red CD player, small earphones, and a fairly empty-looking CD case. Naruto only had to rummage for a few seconds until he found both his player and case. Is that duct tape? Arashi asked with a hint of amusement in his voice. Well, you know it is the best way to fix something if you have a tight budget. Naruto answered, looking at where the slightly worn duct tape held the CD player's top to its bottom. Words scratched into the metal of the machine that Naruto wouldn't translate for anybody. No matter how nice they asked. The same was for the case, duct tape put hastily over the holes and fixing the rips of the material that needed it. You did it yesterday, I want my turn. Grow up Miyuki and act mature. I let you have your music 3 times last week and you had your CD player on your head all 3 times. How unfair is that? Look, I'm sorry about that, but I'd like my music to listen to. Yeah right, it's my turn and you know it. As the yelling contest was reaching its crescendo, the teacher had plugged his ears with wax by now, since he knew both girls did this out of habit, not animosity. Naruto made a very brave move. Walking over to the irate girls, he suggested, how about some classic rock? Holding out a CD that had been burned in which he had bought very cheap, he gave it up for the time being as a peace offering. Okay, both girls said, in unison once more. With that done, Naruto made his way to a table, grabbing a piece of paper and a mechanical pencil. Sitting down with both Arashi and Miyuki, he popped a CD into his player and switched to the song of his liking. But what should he draw? A puppy? Puppies weren't suspicious, right? Naruto sat for what felt like an eternity, just staring at the blank sheet of paper. Slowly, ever so slowly, an image formed in his head. Listening to the song, he set off to work. At one point, he was so engrossed with what he was drawing he almost didn't notice that someone was trying very hard to sneak an earphone out of his head. Unconsciously swiping at the guilty person's hand, he didn't notice who it was until he actually looked up. Oh, I'm sorry, Miyuki, I didn't mean to hit your hand. It was a reflex of habit. From doing what? Miyuki asked, blowing on where he'd hit her. Well, I am a ninja. Naruto answered, now one earphone off and the other on as he pressed the back button to listen to the song again. You're really a ninja, aren't you? Yep, and I got to tell you, it really isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Hey, what are you listening to? Miyuki asked, taking note in her mind that Naruto really was a ninja. Grabbing his unused earphone, she held it up to her ear for a few seconds before turning to Naruto with a slightly confused look on her face. What language is this? English. I can't remember the name of the band though. But, I do have a whole CD of them if you'd like to borrow it. That's cool, but I got to ask, can you actually understand this? Most of it, but sometimes things get lost in the translations and I get confused every now and then. Naruto said, still continuing with his drawing. Who taught you that language? Your parents or something? No, my parents died when I was a baby, so I've taught myself. Naruto said with a calm and uncaring tone. Really, why should he feel sad for people he had never met? Sure, sometimes when things got hard or if he was feeling really lonely he would wish that he had at least one memory or picture of them, but he had done without for 13 years. He had gotten used to holding down such silly, maybe, and, what if, hoping and wishing did nothing, and he knew that all too well. That's so cool you were able to teach yourself. I'm a little too hyper for that sort of thing, I would never be able to concentrate. Miyuki said, grinning and taking the seat next to Naruto. That's awesome, Miyuki said, touching the piece of paper Naruto was working on with his fingertips. Naruto glanced once again at those beautiful wrists and shivered. It always gave him the chills when he would think like that. Like self-mutilation was some sort of accepted, acclaimed art form. Naruto looked toward Miyuki and smiled. You really think so? He asked, pulling the paper a bit farther away from his face to examine it fully. A girl in a small room, suspended by nothing but air itself, her long hair flowing every which way, appearing to be in a deep, if not slightly awkward-looking sleep, her limbs hanging oddly and limply. Of course I do, Miyuki answered, punching Naruto softly on the shoulder. Now this was the one thing Naruto had been dreading all day. One-on-one. Mano y mano. You, me and a gun. A freaking psychologist poking his mind, trying to get him to spill his nasty guts. This was not going to be very pleasant and Naruto already knew that. So, your name is Naruto Uzumaki, right? The lady next to him asked. She was middle-aged, graying hair in a low ponytail, suave glasses at the bridge of her nose, patterned turtleneck and jeans clothing her. She sat Indian style in her chair, a clipboard, a pen and papers in her hands. That's what it says on that paper, right? The woman sighed quietly, jotting something on her paper. So Naruto, she began, what's your favorite type of music? Naruto opened his mouth as soon as she began speaking, thinking he'd have to defend himself from her prodding words as soon as she was done. But as his mind grasped the simplicity of what she had said, all that came out was Huh? You know, music? Those wonderful tunes you listen to get your groove on? Naruto was, to say the least, somewhat stunned at the woman's line of questioning. Aren't you, supposed to ask me deep questions like, how has your family life been? And, how does it all make you feel? Well, aren't you? The woman laughed cheerily for a moment. Oh heavens no, I don't make you talk about anything that you don't want to, Naruto. I always start off with music because, from what I've seen, everyone has at least one favorite song they like to talk about. Again for the second time that day, Naruto let the simple thought, maybe this place isn't so bad, cross his mind. The rest of the day passed fairly quietly, Naruto not doing much of anything during music therapy except for watching Miyuki play the room's old set of drums and Arashi strumming the strings of his bass. Where do you get that bass from, Arashi? Naruto had asked, looking longingly at the beautiful black-colored instrument. A dulled sadness passed over those green eyes as he explained. About a year ago, someone I knew fairly well in here killed himself. He was in his 20s and he'd already written up a will and whatnot. In it, he left his collection of instruments to this rehab center. He left the bass to me specifically. Shrugging his shoulders as if to shake off the feelings that came with the story, Arashi continued to play the strings, Miyuki keeping in time with the drum set. Recreational time was spent with Naruto and Miyuki continuing their DDR tournament, attracting a whole new crowd of bystanders, most if not all just amazed as the first group had been by the speed at which both bodies' feet were moving across the mats, techno music pumping in their ears with their repetitive yet catchy tunes. And by bedtime, after a wonderful dinner with his newfound companions, Naruto couldn't help letting the thought, this place can't be so bad, pass through his mind for a third time that day. Now, his second day hadn't started off so bad as it had eventually ended up. Arashi had woken him up, he had breakfast and went to all the places he was supposed to go to, that was, until he had an unexpected visitor. Naruto Uzumaki? A woman called for him as he was busy trying to finish his picture he had started yesterday. Looking to Miyuki and Arashi for an explanation, Miyuki shrugged her shoulders while Arashi whispered. They usually only let you skip things like this when you have a visitor. Naruto's stomach dropped to his feet. Naruto followed the woman silently out of the room, a few steps behind her as they reached what he knew was a waiting room of sorts for this floor. And who should be sitting there but none other than Uchiha Sasuke in the pale flesh, white shorts and a dark sweatshirt replacing the ordinary shirt one would normally see on the boy. As the woman left them, Naruto had only one thing to say. So, what's up? By no means was Sasuke an idiot. By no means did Sasuke get easily duped or surprised. By no means was Sasuke scared easily by things that did not involve other ninjas of the enemy type. And by no means did Sasuke dwell on things for very long that did not include making him stronger in some way, shape or form. Just because Naruto had managed to bring him back to this village did not mean he still didn't want to avenge his family, far from it. Or, at least that's what he had thought. But now he wasn't all too sure about it, with the whole situation with him not being able to see what the hell Naruto was doing until it was accidentally shoved into his face. It took him a few hours after he had gotten Naruto safely to the hospital, had bumped into Kakashi and told him what had happened and had finally gotten the blood out of his white pants without bleach that what he had seen finally hit him. He was angry, by whatever holy things that exist had he been irate. How dare the idiot do something as stupid as try to kill himself? Now, we all know that Sasuke was jumping to conclusions, and he too eventually figured this out as well. This, however, he did not accomplish until he had seriously given a good number of trees a few new huge holes in some cases. There was no more tree and had eventually calmed himself enough to look at the facts he had seen. 1. Naruto had looked scared, not confident of the possibility of death, so he could probably rule out a suicide attempt as he had first thought. 2. It had been near to impossible to not notice the large number of scars that littered those arms. He then concluded that Naruto had made this act a habit. How long ago it had started he had yet to find out. It was at that point that Sasuke realized he was actually surprised. What the hell would drive Naruto to do something like that? What could possibly make him do that? Rip his own body to shreds because of something that was bugging him that badly? Now, Sasuke didn't like to be hypocritical and admitted to himself that at one point in his life he had done the same thing a few times. But try as he might, he could not remember the exact emotions that had led him to take sharpness to his own flesh. And then over the next few hours, Sasuke was bombarded with so many emotions in great waves that he had to wonder if this was what it was like to be a menstruating woman. Guilt, annoyance, betrayal, another dose of fear, self-doubt. Almost any and all negative emotions passed through the Uchiha that sleepless night. So, all in all, this visit was just as nerve-wracking for Sasuke as it was for Naruto. Sasuke stood up, shoving his hands into his pockets and began to stroll, saying, "Let's walk." Naruto complied, knowing that there would be far more than just walking during this visit. Naruto knew he was being uncharacteristically quiet and could see Sasuke glance at him every now and then, as if to say, "Please say something, you're being too quiet and it's scary." Naruto smiled at the thought of Sasuke actually saying something like that. "What's so funny?" Sasuke asked, eyebrow arched. "Just a thought," Naruto said, his nervousness nearly getting the best of him. A few minutes more passed as they walked, before Sasuke asked that damn dreaded question. Why? One simple word, and yet right now it felt as if it would eat him up. Naruto gulped down the lump in his throat silently, thinking for a moment. "'Cause shit happens," he answered flatly. Without a hitch, Sasuke quickly latched onto Naruto's arm, pulled up the sleeve of the still borrowed sweatshirt, and shoved the scared flesh back in its owner's face. "Why did this happen?" he asked. Even if he would never say it to his face, that day Naruto saw more fear and confusion in Sasuke's eyes than he had ever seen before. Jerking his arm sharply away, not bothering to pull the sleeve down just to make Sasuke as uncomfortable as he was, Naruto spoke slowly, articulating each word that came out of his mouth. "Because shit happens. Because bad shit happens every day and I deal with it the only way I know how to. Because I'm depressed half the time. But don't say anything because I knew something like this." Naruto waved his arms around to show he was talking about his current home, would happen if I ever spoke up. "I never said anything because I didn't want anyone's fucking pity. It's a stupid, embarrassing emotion that's usually wasted on people who don't want it." Sasuke was quiet for a moment, neither noticing they had stopped walking. "If you had just said something to someone." "Oh, shut up." That coming from the epitome of a human rock. "Bullshit, Sasuke, complete bullshit. Don't be a hypocrite, at least I'm not the one with a ton of scars on their arms." Now that pissed Naruto off. How dare he? How could he say anything about something he knew nothing about? And then there it was, a small pulse of absolute power pushed its way through him. He felt as if he were nothing and everything at once. He felt as if that power was extending his body, to the point he could feel the fabric of Sasuke's sweatshirt. Willing the obviously invisible power to push Sasuke, and complied willingly as he nearly screamed at his peer. And all of this happened in less than the blink of an eye. Like you know worth shit. He watched as Sasuke tumbled off his feet and land on the ground on his butt, sitting there for a moment in confusion to see if there was anyone else there to push him. To see if he had tripped on something maybe. Naruto knew better though, as he slouched to the ground exhausted. He knew that that power that was now making its way back inside of him had been what had done it, had pushed Sasuke. He had no way to explain it. It would show up at odd moments in his life, usually when he was under some sort of stress. Once, not too long ago actually, he had watched as he and this odd power had picked up a small rock without his hands, managing to keep it suspended in mid-air for a full 2 seconds. It would always leave him feeling very tired though, and would usually be followed by a headache. But he was always amazed by that power that coursed through him when those moments would happen. It felt like he could break the entire universe if he wanted, or save it in its entirety. Watching as Sasuke stood back up and brushed himself off with half-lidded eyes, Naruto too was able to make it back to his didn't say anything about the words they'd exchange. They didn't need to. Hey, Naruto asked as they began walking back the way they had come. Does anyone but Kakashi know? Not wanting to know exactly how he knew that Kakashi was aware of the situation, Sasuke simply nodded. Good, I'd like it to stay that way, if you could. He said as they reached the waiting room again, Sasuke waiting for the attendant to unlock the door for him. Reaching the outside with its brisk cold air, Sasuke slammed his fist into a defenseless store wall. Instead of clearing up questions, the visit had simply created more. Unknown to him, his only female teammate stared curiously at him when she spotted that flash of absolute midnight hair, wondering to herself why she had just seen him walk out of a rehabilitation center. Sinking deeply into his bed, Naruto groaned as his teacher's words floated back into memory. I'll give you 2 days. Kakashi would be coming tomorrow. Sakura was not dumb, she wasn't dim or stupid either, she didn't not notice details in everyday life, despite what some of you, or maybe all of you, I'm not quite sure, may think. Sure, she would be the first to admit that when she was just a bit younger she had been immature, a slight understatement. But then again, she wasn't ever the one to first point out that she had grown up tremendously since she first became a genin. Her teacher had noticed it before her mother noticed it before she did, her teammates noticed it before her too, hell, even her rival realized how much she had matured in little less than a year. But even so, even with all her rather newfound maturity, Sakura still had her moments of immaturity, as we all do. This was one of the reasons Sasuke didn't expect her to try and find out why their other teammate could not be found anywhere he would normally be. But, to his slight surprise, she did. And that was why he had been avoiding her for at least a week straight, walking quickly in the opposite direction she was going if he happened to spot her somewhere, blurting out, rather panicky when it's recalled, that he had something to do if she happened to find him and ask him if she could talk to him. All of this had worked so far, and he hadn't expected her to try anything else than meet him in public and try to get him to tell her what the hell was going on. And that was why it greatly surprised him when he answered the door the day after speaking with Naruto to find a very annoyed-looking Sakura. Usual ninja clothes replaced with ones akin to those of a civilian. Red sweater, blue jeans and tennis shoes, she pushed through his doorway, turned to meet his eyes. A glare formed on those green eyes that had never been directed at him before. Closing the door, he asked simply and cool, "What?" Her glare deepened as she crossed her arms over her chest, saying, "You know what, Sasuke-kun? You've been avoiding me for a whole week. Kakashi hasn't assigned any missions or training sessions, and neither of you will speak to me. I want to know where Naruto is." And then she started crying. He hated it when people cried, it made him feel awkward and displaced. Emotions, my dear reader, were one of the few things Sasuke was no genius at. It wasn't like she was bawling, but still, she stood up straight, as if to say she wasn't going to stop until he told her what was going on. And then she spoke again. "I know you and Kakashi know where he is, if you didn't you wouldn't be avoiding me like I was some sort of plague. It ticks me off that neither of you will tell me, because I'm his teammate too, you know," she said, her voice cracking every now and then. There was silence for a minute or two that was calmly filled with the sound of Sakura sniffling and the sound of water hitting the floor. "I'll show you, but his won't like it," Sasuke said, finally not being able to handle the idea of Sakura crying over something like this. But then again, had Sasuke been any normal person, he probably would have been just as distraught as she was. Her crying stopped as a look of shock came over her face. Apparently, she had prepared herself for the worst, which would have been Sasuke shrugging her off and telling her to get out of his home. Sasuke said nothing as he opened and walked out the front door, listening as Sakura followed behind, closing the door. The early evening of mid-October was pleasant enough, cool winds and a warming sun, but still Sasuke was glad for the long-sleeve shirt under his normal high-collared shirt. Before long he'd have to replace the white shorts he normally wore with a pair of pants, as he always did when it came time for winter. Walking close to him, Sasuke could see that Sakura was indeed quite confused. She knew the only place this road would lead to was that rehabilitation center she had seen Sasuke come from yesterday. She stopped walking, staring at the back of Sasuke's head. Turning around as he stopped, Sasuke arched an eyebrow at her. silently asking what was she doing. He couldn't help but wonder if she had figured it out for herself. He's at the rehabilitation center, isn't he? Sasuke didn't need to answer as she started walking again, he going the opposite direction as she walked past him, directly towards the center. He knew she was mature enough to handle this, he hoped. It was during breakfast that both Miyuki and Arashi noticed the small, subtle changes in their new friend. Far more quiet than usual, pushing the food around the tray, taking a nibble or two before declaring he was full, taking the tray to the conveyor belt to where it would be cleaned, and they still had 15 minutes left to eat. Something was wrong. What's up? Miyuki asked as he sat back down from carrying his finished tray over to the belt. Nothing much, just tired. I hope you know today is the official, do not bullshit your friends, holiday. It's when you can't try and bullshit your friends. Miyuki said with a mock serious tone. Naruto snorted and dug his head into his orange coat-covered arms, the old thing having been returned to him when Miyuki finally realized how tiring the color could be on one's eyes. You sound like a shrink. He answered, not really wanting to explain why he was so nervous and edgy and quiet in all the things he hadn't been around them. It's also, don't try and change the subject, Day. Didn't you know? It was Arashi who spoke this time, munching away at his food and drinking his black coffee. Naruto stayed silent for a moment, looking up only to see two sets of eyes waiting patiently for his answer. Well, you guys might not know this, but when I first came here, I jumped out of a window on the first section here. Obviously they eventually caught me and brought me back here. Naruto started, leaving out details for the moment and listened to Miyuki whisper, I knew that had to be you who did that. But, Naruto said, the person who they ended up sending to find me is my sensei, for being a ninja you know. And so, he brought me back here and we sort of talked. Naruto said, swaying as his tone changed from fairly serious to almost uncaring. Well, what did he say? Is it the reason why you're so, like this? Arashi asked, idly trying to spin his chopsticks like a top. Naruto cleared his throat and watched Miyuki chug her carton of milk before speaking. He said he'd give me 2 days before we're going to have a talk, and it's been 2 days. Both winced as what was said made its way to their brains. They had heard many people complain how nerve-wracking a talk could be. They had both seen extreme cases of this, where some people actually threw up before such a talk, some even passed out and more than one had tried to run away. Luckily, or unlikely, depends on how you look at it, neither Miyuki nor Arashi had ever had to endure such a thing. Simply because all of their living relatives had died a long time ago and their parents had died on their own time. Neither sets of deaths at all enjoyable. Naruto was the first one they had ever seen hide his nervousness this well, it was sort of scary. Well, no wonder you acting so out of sorts. You must be nervous out of your mind. Miyuki said. Well, I was hoping it wouldn't be that intimidating. All three looked to the owner of the voice, each having a different reaction. Arashi looked at him for a moment, smiled and went back to eating what little food he had left. Naruto paled considerable and continued to stare. Miyuki, on the other hand. Ah, creepy sneaky pervert, don't sneak up on me, she said, pointing an offending finger at him. Kakashi's visible eye turned downwards in mock sadness. The creepy and sneaky I can understand, but I haven't done anything perverted. Who are you creepy pervert and why have you come amongst us rejects? Miyuki yelled dramatically, causing several tables full of people to turn their attention towards the creepy pervert. I have come to talk with Naruto, Kakashi said, eye curling into a smile. Miyuki stared for a moment, turned to Naruto and asked, so he's, yep, and that's why, yep, and is he really a? Yep, he's a pervert. Hey, what I read has nothing to do with my likes and dislikes. Kakashi said, whipping out said reading material. Oh, Miyuki said, sitting back down and thoroughly not enjoying the awkward silence that had settled. Snapping the book shut, Kakashi said quietly. Naruto, I need to speak with you. Standing up and following the retreating back of his teacher, Naruto glanced back as both of the cousins held up their thumbs, mouthing the words, good luck. Making their way down the halls, Kakashi led them into the boys' sleeping quarters and sat down on the first bed of the room, leaving Naruto to stand there. Patting the spot next to him, Naruto made his way to the bed and sat down next to his sensei, listening to the bed creak under their weight. And then, there was a deep silence. One thing Naruto hated most in the world was waiting when you knew something big was going to happen. He couldn't help but think back to a saying he had heard once, "The weight itself can kill you." Right now it couldn't be truer. "Naruto?" Kakashi began, listening to the sound of his student's heart speed up. Kakashi sighed. He didn't want his student to be scared or nervous, but he guessed a little bit of nervousness or fright would have to come if he wanted to figure things out, even if he didn't want the fright or nervousness to happen to begin with. "Why?" he asked, hoping that answering that simple question wouldn't be too much for the boy. But it might have been, because that's when the floodgates decided to open for Naruto. Silently and seemingly without much emotion, Naruto cried openly in front of his teacher. Now, it wasn't like Kakashi hadn't seen Naruto cry before, far from it. But this time, it seemed different. Before, Kakashi had only seen the boy cry out of emotion he felt for other people or out of pure anger and frustration brought on by people or that was held for people. But this just seemed to come from nothing but emotions Naruto had about himself. Because Naruto finally spoke, voice cracking slightly, "Bad stuff happens to me all the time, Kakashi-sensei. Stuff that I don't know how to deal with at all and I hate myself for it." Naruto was quiet for a moment, before continuing, "I mean, what normal person does this to themselves?" Naruto seemed to be asking himself more than Kakashi as he held out his slightly exposed arm, the sharp contrast of his scars showing clearly against his skin. "Well, you know, it wasn't your fault that this abnormal life was given to you. Why take it out on yourself?" Kakashi asked, staring intently at the exposed flesh of his student's wrist. "Who else would I take it out on? It's not like I have a personal punching bag or anything, and it's not like anyone else taught me how to deal with shit like this." Naruto answered, bringing his knees to his chest and hugging them there. Eyes stopped crying and he wiped away the tears on his face. "Shit like what?" Kakashi asked, having an idea what he could be referring to. A bitter smile formed on Naruto's as he spoke. "Did you know, Kakashi-sensei? I was 5 the first time I got seriously beaten up on my birthday. I hurt so bad afterwards I didn't move from my home for 3 days, and no one came to make sure if I was even alive, except for the Hokage-sama. And don't ask why I didn't tell anyone." Naruto finished as Kakashi had, in fact, been opening his mouth to ask just that. Naruto laughed bitterly as he continued. "I guess I had already learned by then that if I made a big deal out of what people here sometimes do to me, they make an even bigger deal out of it once they served whatever punishment they were given. And all I ever wanted them to do was be done with whatever they happened to be doing at the time and leave me be." "Well, what would they do to you?" Kakashi asked, hoping it wasn't what he was thinking they might do. Naruto shrugged his shoulder in an uninterested fashion. "Mostly just stole stuff or wrecked the apartment, nothing that couldn't be fixed." He heard the small sigh of relief that came from Kakashi's mouth. Now Naruto was glad he had gone against the idea of maybe telling him that those people would often if not always molest him if they broke into his apartment when he was there, given they had never actually gone the whole way and had done it with him. Just touch and being touched. But by no means did this not affect Naruto. In fact, it had been one of the main reasons he had ever even picked up a blade to begin with. "Naruto, let me see your arms," Kakashi said, rather abruptly. A look of shock crossed over Naruto's face before he dug his face into his arms, still wrapped around his curled-up legs. Mumbling something Kakashi couldn't quite catch, he set his legs down so his feet almost touched the ground and shrugged off one sleeve of his coat, leaving the exposé flesh of his forearm and most of his upper arm to the prying eyes of his teacher. Naruto couldn't help but feel like climbing into a small hole in the ground and staying there until his lifetime was over. "Both arms please, Naruto," Kakashi said. Naruto sighed, shrugged off the other sleeve of the jacket, stood up, held his arms out for his sensei to see, and turned his head as to not see what emotions might flash his that single eye. Kakashi couldn't believe it, there were so many scars. He gently took the small wrists into his hands, running a thumb over the nearest marking. He studied them carefully, turning the arms over and back again and again. Some of the scars were in neat rows, like little soldiers, others were scattered at random. Some were vast, others skinny. Some were very old, some still an angry red. Some that had healed had become bumps because of how deep they had been. Some were even on the tops of his hands. In all his years, Kakashi had seen many things that he wished to this very day he could forget. But nothing else except for Obito's attempted suicide compared to this. To see someone, his student and someone he considered precious no less, doing this to themselves it was. He couldn't even think of a proper words for it. It felt horrible knowing someone you cared about was suffering and not really knowing what to do to help them. Naruto, how long have you been doing this? Kakashi asked, trying to make eye contact with the boy. Once again, Naruto mumbled something that Kakashi couldn't catch. Naruto, even if I'm a ninja, I still can't hear what you're saying if all you do is mumble. It's been 5 years, a few days over 5 years, Kakashi-sensei. Naruto said, eyes still averted. Kakashi dropped Naruto's arms so they hung at his sides. There was a small lapse of time before Kakashi spoke again. How did you hide them? Kakashi continued. I made a jutsu for it. It makes an illusion that my skin isn't like this. He gestured to the skin of his forearms. I use that a lot, but I sometimes cover them up with clothes, you know. Naruto said, twiddling his thumbs. You've cut yourself in places other than your arms, right? Kakashi asked. Naruto visible flinched at the words, you've cut yourself. Was the answer Kakashi's received for his question. He took a moment to look at his student and was saddened by the image his mind saw and the thought behind it. The boy who to a rather good portion of the village was a scapegoat, had no biological parents to speak of, lived alone in a rundown apartment, and hurt himself because no one had ever bothered to teach him as a child what could help him cope when he felt sad, angry or depressed. Then and there, Kakashi had a very small epiphany. If his train of thought was the truth, every basic aspect of normal human behavior for the boy had been self-taught. Now that he thought on it, it amazed Kakashi how much Naruto had taught himself in his short lifetime. Would have had to teach himself to read and write, would have had to try to learn proper manners, of both the etiquette and social kind. Why, the boy would have had to grown up and teach himself when he was probably just learning to walk. Standing up, Kakashi wrapped his arms around the short boy, squeezing slightly as he heard Naruto start crying again, a little louder than before. How lonely that lifestyle must have been. No wonder he was in enough pain to seriously do what he was doing. You don't have to show me them, just tell me where they are. Kakashi whispered, rubbing circles on Naruto's back as he felt the boy clutch at his shirt. Everywhere. Kakashi heard the muffled reply as his shirt started to feel damp. They're everywhere. On my sides, my legs, my thighs, my chest, my shoulders, the nape of my neck. I put them wherever I can reach. Kakashi again, for the second time that day, stunned at the pain the boy would inflict upon himself. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, Kakashi-sensei. Kakashi could hear the boy sob into his shirt. It's okay, Naruto, shush, it's okay. The older man tried to calm the boy down enough so he would stop crying at least. Just, can you promise me you won't do it again? Can you promise me that? No, Naruto said, sobs reducing until he was only hiccuping, tears still soaking into his teacher's shirt. Why can't you promise me that? Kakashi asked, continuing with the back rubbing. 'Cause I know already I'm not ready to stop, and I don't want to make a promise with you and turn right around and break it. It's against my ninja path anyways. Naruto said. Both were silent as Naruto sniffled a little. And, can you tell me why can't you stop? Kakashi asked. Because this village will always hate me for something I supposedly did when I was a newborn. This village will never see me as I am. I'm just a dumb kid trying to get through life, not the demon that killed their loved ones. Naruto replied, looking up and staring Kakashi straight in the eye with his red-rimmed and slightly bloodshot eyes. Why can't they see there was no possible way for me to do what some of them blame me for? I was a baby when the fox was sealed in me. I didn't even have a choice in the matter. How can they be so stupid? Naruto asked, on the verge of crying again. Kakashi was silent for a moment, thinking over what should be said. They don't know any other way, and I know it's not fair to you, and I know it's not your fault, and you are very correct about them being stupid. None of what's happened to them and their families years ago gives them the right to treat you like they do. No matter what they think you did or didn't do, if you just told me, Kakashi said, trailing off as Naruto crushed his face into his sensei's stomach as he began to cry again, much louder than before, and was now bordering the sobbing territory. Sighing deeply, turning his head to the ceiling, and squeezing his arms around the small figure once again, he asked in a soft voice. What happened to you, Naruto? What happened to you that would make you hurt yourself so badly? Kakashi asked the boy softly. His answer was silence, all except for the boy's clutch on his shirt becoming, if possibly, stronger and his crying becoming loud and heart-wrenching sobbing. When he randomly entered his group therapy session, no one, not even Arashi or Miyuki, had asked what had happened and no one asked why he was late. The look on his face was enough to tell them anyways. Had a bad day so far, I take it. Tamata, his shrink, said to him as he flopped tiredly into a large plush chair she had in her room. What gave that away? Naruto answered sarcastically, well aware he probably didn't look so hot right at that moment. Want to talk about it? She asked, rather timidly, for an experienced shrink such as herself knew that some patients could get very violent if asked the wrong question. No, I hate talking about things that don't need to be brought up. He answered, curling up into the overly large chair. She didn't need to know that since and when he was little, since people would often break into his home and steal what little money and valuables he owned when he was away, the easiest way to make money was to deliver drugs for the dealers that lived not too far away from his apartment. She didn't need to know that by the time he was 10 he had tried practically every illegal drug under the sun. Even to this day would still steal a pinch here and there when the cutting wasn't enough to let him drown his pain out. She also didn't need to know that if the dealers decided to be stingy with the money he needed to feed himself with, it usually meant he'd have to disguise himself in his Wai no Jutsu form, usually a little altered, head over to even shadier parts of town, and give hand jobs for the price of $5. Blowjobs were an extra 5. No, in fact no one needed to know all these things, even if he desperately wanted someone to know what the hell he had been through and what he was still going through. He wanted at least someone to know how hard it was for him to push his depression and pain down past his knees and into his feet each day and have a huge smile on his face. He knew that his smile could brighten up people's day, simply because he was Naruto, the one who was never sad, the little brother, the one who always made you smile. The epitome of a bubbling youthful and happy kid. What would they think if they knew what he had to do when they weren't around, just so he could live and keep that smile up for them, even if it wasn't really real at all? Well, the woman said, if I am to be so bold to say, those scars are telling everyone who see them a completely different story than you try to portray. Naruto had no comeback for that, other than a barely spoken sentence. I'm screwed up, aren't I? Only just a little, so far as I can tell. If you'd speak to me more openly about things, I'd be able to make a better statement for that question. Naruto was positive that eventually, this woman would know more about him than any other. Not today, and probably not tomorrow, but, yeah, someday she'd know the things that he thought she didn't need to know. So, Miyuki, how have you been? A very young doctor asked, clipboard and pen in hand, sitting comfortably as she waited for Miyuki to get comfortable. Well, now that I think about it, pretty good. Miyuki said, thinking about how the last 2 days had gone. Minus last night's dream. I see, I've heard you've made a friend out of the new boy who came. What's his name? The woman asked, leaning back in her chair and kicking off her high heels. Naruto, Uzumaki Naruto. And yeah, he's nice enough, but I still haven't fully given him my trust. Miyuki said, twirling a strand of her long white hair between her fingers. So, have you had any thoughts of cutting since yesterday? I heard one of the attendants found you awake really late last night. Miyuki sighed. She hated it when shrinks wanted you to say things out loud so you'd hear them yourself. What do you think happened, Sarai? I had the same nightmare I always do. My dad beat me up, made me touch him and touched me back, like when it happened for real, Miyuki said, keeping a calm exterior in firm place. Sarai sighed heavily. What am I going to do with you? She asked good-naturedly. You could always say, she's not crazy anymore, let her out. Miyuki suggested, slightly hopeful. Sarai looked at her for a moment and snorted in laughter. That's what I love about you, Miyuki. You've got such a great sense of humor. You may bask in my glory. Miyuki said sarcastically, sticking out her tongue happily as she listened to her shrink laugh her butt off. By the time the second recreational time rolled around, Naruto was beyond mentally tired. Hadn't felt like eating during lunch so was now hungry, and the only thing good that had come out of today had been he'd been able to sneak his CD and CD player out of the art therapy room. Plopping down onto his bed in the boys' dorm, he curled up onto the comfortable mattress and tried to let himself fall asleep to the music pumping into his ears. I never conquered, rarely came. 16 just held such better days. Days when I still felt alive. We couldn't wait to get outside. The world was wide, too late to try. The tour was over, we'd survived. I couldn't wait till I got home. To pass the time in my room alone. Not the most proper song for someone to catch him listening to, but then again, He didn't expect many people, if any at all, here to understand the English language, so he suspected he was fairly safe. Naruto could feel his mind shutting off for rest and fell asleep to the song ringing in his ears. I never thought I'd die alone. Another 6 months I'll be unknown. Give all my things to all my friends. You'll never step foot in my room again. You'll close it off, board it up. Remember the time that I spilled the cup of apple juice in the hall. Please tell mom this is not her fault. Naruto. A voice snapped him out of sleep, causing a chain reaction consisting of Naruto yelping, the person standing by him yelping, and then the person standing in the doorway yelped as well, despite herself. Upon recognizing exactly whose yelp from the doorway belonged to, Naruto promptly fell out of bed, CD wiring tangling his feet. Man, what kind of ninja are you? Miyuki asked as she walked around to the side of the bed Naruto had fallen onto, helping the entangling process and helping him to his feet. Looking to the doorway, 2 words escaped his mouth. Hey Sakura? Oh, so you do know her. Miyuki said, I'll let you guys talk, I'll bring you something if you miss dinner, okay? And then she was gone. About 10 minutes earlier, in the waiting room, Sakura had managed to find what section Naruto was staying in and what level as well, and had finally made it to her destination with only a slight headache from it all. What she met on the other side didn't help it too much. Where the waiting room and desk was sat a fairly short row of chairs, only one being occupied at the moment, the desk itself void of personnel. As the door behind her clicked shut, Sakura sighed in relief that there was now something between her and that crazy cure of a woman. Sakura looked from the girl sitting in a far chair to the desk and back. I might be able to help you if you asked. The white-haired girl said, snapping the purple book in her hands shut, standing up and straightened her sweatshirt and jeans. Sakura couldn't help but be slightly intimidated by the red stare she received from the girl, and all she managed to stammer out was a simple, I'm looking for someone. Well, who are you looking for? She asked, tilting her head to the side. Uzumaki Naruto. Sakura answered. The girl seemed to deflate slightly, putting her hands to her face and sighing angrily. You guys need to give him a break, you know. What, was all Sakura managed before the girl held her hand up, a sigh to stop talking. Yesterday, peacock-haired pretty boys showed up and they ended up having a pretty loud argument. Today his sneaky perverted sensei came in and talked with him for more than 2 hours, and now you show up. How exactly do you know him? The white-haired girl inquired. Matching the descriptions of the 2 people she had described, Sakura quickly concluded that, indeed, both Sasuke and Kakashi had already visited the boy. I'm his teammate, she answered. Ah, I see, you know how lucky you are? Now this caught Sakura totally off guard. What do you mean? I mean, do you know just how lucky you are to have your life? You're pretty, you're obviously smart, you probably have a ton of friends, loving parents. Do you know how many people here would kill themselves to have a shot to have a life like yours? The girl said, an odd look coming across her eyes for a moment, it passing as soon as it had come. Sakura stared, having nothing to say for herself, chewing over the girl's words. The girl sighed again. Don't mind my rambling, I'll show you where he is. But Sakura did mind her rambling, and thought on it too. Was she really that lucky to be who she was, to have her life? A very odd silence filled the room as Naruto watched Sakura and Sakura watched Naruto. Sakura was the first to move. Flinging herself onto him, she latched onto him in the form of a hug. What are you doing here? Naruto asked, gingerly embracing her back. As she let go of him, he saw her eyes were glazed over with water and his breath hitched. I was scared. I didn't know where you were, and neither Sasuke nor Kakashi would say a word to me. Please don't get mad at Sasuke. I made him at least point me in the direction you were in. Sakura said, rubbing her eyes free of water. Pushing what he was really feeling past his knees and into his feet, he managed a smile to form on his lips. When all he really wanted to do was freak out appropriately and be left alone. Probably even get all angsty and such. Ah, I'm sorry I worried you, Sakura. He left his sentence hanging. Why are you staying here anyways? What happened? A sacred look filled Sakura's eyes again, looking Naruto up and down as if there would be a sign for her to read on what had happened. Naruto was silent for a moment, truly now wishing he could just properly freak out and not have to deal with this for the moment. Taking a deep breath and looking away from Sakura's eyes, he slid one sleeve of his coat far up enough that he knew she'd be able to see clearly what had been done. When several moments had passed, Naruto lowered the sleeve, turned, and sat back down on his bed, his back facing Sakura. He waited for her to leave, he waited for her to yell, be disgusted, hit him, but he didn't expect what happened next. Two slender arms wrapped around his shoulders and the bed sank slightly with her added weight. "I'm sorry, so sorry Naruto." Sakura whispered, her voice full of emotion. They sat like that for some time and probably would have had Sakura not gotten up, gently kissed the back of Naruto's golden hair-covered head and left, promising to be back soon. A while later, a voice accompanied a new weight that made the bed sink slightly. "Want to talk about it?" Arashi asked, resting his own back against Naruto's. He pushed a small napkin full of food to Naruto. Naruto snorted, sighed and then began with a simple, "Today sucked really bad, and I mean really bad." Ino was a person who loved surprises, but this was almost too much. Here was her sworn rival of love, standing at the doorway to her family's flower shop, bawling her eyes out. Ino raised an eyebrow, her rival mode soon being drowned out by concerned for sometimes friend mode. "What happened Sakura?" Ino asked, inviting her inside. Sakura was silent for a moment, taking time to try and compose herself. "Ino, I need to talk to you about Naruto." Now, that took the cake when it came to surprises in Ino's book. Thinking back on it as she crawled into the futon Ino had set up for her, the blonde had convinced the other girl to stay the night after her retelling of what had happened and what she had seen. The words of that white-haired girl played in her mind. There were certain techniques people learn in life and there are usually certain sayings that go along with them. Be the first one working and the last to finish. Look before you jump, live every moment as if it were your last. Naruto had never really concerned himself with techniques that couldn't help him feed himself. Always give the tip a good sucking. Nibble it every now and then too, just to entice him even more. Deep-throat it as much as possible. Guys loved it when you did stuff like that. Whatever part of it wasn't in your mouth, always make sure your hands were playing with skin. Never, ever forget the balls, messing around with those always got the job done quicker. Think of something else other than what you were doing. That should always help drown out the moans those perverts would let loose when you'd hit just the right spot, or when they finished. In and out, up and down. You always have to keep the rhythm. Always do your best, no matter what. If you do, it'll be over quicker and you won't have it in your mouth or hands anymore. Remember, if he tells you to swallow his load, do it, no matter the slimy feeling you get in the back of your throat that doesn't go away for a week. And don't ever throw it back up, not until he's gone anyways. That was the only advice Naruto had ever found useful, and as always, he was putting the advice to good use. Right there, that's a good girl. He could hear the man above him all but moan, blocking out the sounds as he sped up the antics of his mouth and hands, most certainly wanting to finish this. He thought on what he'd have to do when he got home. Water the plants, hide the money he earned so it wouldn't get stolen, maybe cut a little bit, go to the river and clean his clothes. And then there was that nasty, slimy feeling in the back of his throat again. Swallow it, he heard the man groan deeply. Closing his eyes and with one swift swallow of his throat muscles, the immediate sliminess was gone. Its texture to stay there though for over a week. The man pulled out of his mouth, and listening to the sound of a zipper and a wallet being taken out, Naruto sat on the floor. "Here," the man said simply, letting the bills Naruto had charged him for his services flutter onto the floor, leaving the men's bathroom without another word. Diving for the stall next to him, Naruto barely made it to the opening of the toilet as he felt his stomach heave up what he had just swallowed. White, creamy looking and a bit thick, it slowly sunk to the bottom of the bowel, little chunks of what he had earlier eaten floating along the surface like buoys on a lake. Quickly shoving his fingers back down his throat, Naruto heaved again, this time bringing up nothing but liquid and bile. Even if it stung his throat something terrible and even if it made his eyes water and nose run, Naruto always made sure that that shit never stayed in his body for too long. Flushing the toilet, Naruto crawled back out of the stall, sitting still for what seemed like hours when it was only but a minute or two. Then, gathering the bills and using the wall to stand up, Naruto looked at his disguised self that stared back at him in the mirror. Long silky black hair, creamy skin and plump red lips, golden brown eyes. Same height as he was already, a long and extremely form-fitting dress pulled over curves men like his last client would pay big just to have a true and naked glimpse at. Walking to the sink and turning the faucet on high, Naruto splashed cold water onto his face and in his mouth, letting the disguise morph into the next one he needed. He lifted his head back up and was met with yet another face in the mirror. Olive skin flecked with scars, dark and deep cold eyes, standing at a height that you could easily stack two real Narutos on top of another and he would still be taller. Black hair greased back into a small rat tail at the base of his skull. Sighing and watching his new face sigh with him, he left the men's bathroom, tucking the bills he had just gotten into a pocket of the jeans he was wearing, along with a black, long-sleeved shirt. From making $100 as a blow-in-hand job prostitute, to making about another $200 as a drug deliverer. The 10-year-old Naruto had his plate full and enough money to feed himself for a month and pay the small rent for his apartment. Naruto woke with a start for a moment from his dream, realized that he had forgotten why he had woken up to begin with, and promptly fell back asleep. To his rather great surprise and relief, the next week and 5 days passed without much confrontation or issue with anyone he knew outside of the center. Of course, this didn't mean any less drama either way. But as he soon found out, drama here was varied from as serious as attempted murder or suicide. Succeeded cases in both were also considered drama, though you might call it mayhem, to as meager as someone having a slight allergic reaction to a new brand of toilet paper or tissue. So, needless to say, the people of Happy Hills Rehabilitation Center had a very, very broad view of drama. Someone was always doing something to either get themselves in some sort of trouble or something that would get themselves seriously hurt. Given though, all such things like this were quite new to Naruto, while Miyuki and Arashi found all such activities normal, and sometimes even unconsciously joined in the drama. Miyuki was usually the one to antagonize others in the center, always knowing somehow just to push their buttons correctly for them to individually blow up at her, and for some reason she found it beyond funny. While Arashi, on the other hand, seemed to be the exact opposite, getting her out of trouble and making none for himself, quiet and caring, like an older brother figure. But Naruto found out one day exactly what personal drama Arashi could cause himself, and made it rather clear to Naruto why the boy had been brought here to begin with. It had been fairly late in the evening, having already taken head count. Of course it was late in their day, when Naruto had found him in the bathroom. He had sat in the far corner of the room, small cuts running up and down his arms bleeding lightly, with a piece of sharpened metal in his hands. An image that would not have scared Naruto sincerely to the bone had it not been for his eyes. Slightly downcast, staring at the floor as if it were going to eat him up, their green color just as soft but brilliant as ever, but now with nothing but a vast feeling of emptiness behind them slightly that shook Naruto to the core. Arashi, he had said, kneeling down next to the older boy and grabbing hold of the hand that held the piece of metal. The emptiness was cast aside and covered up from those eyes as they had focused on their surroundings. Hiding, as Naruto was fully aware of, could be one of the best self-defense mechanisms if used properly. "How bad is it?" Arashi asked quietly, eyes half-lidded as they turned to stare at the opposite wall. Merely glancing at those arms, Naruto could see that they were indeed nothing more than scratches, but it was the scars that swam along that skin with them that fascinated him. He was always sickened by this fact about himself. Self-mutilation was one thing. Thinking the scars it left behind were beautiful and fascinating in some sort of twisted and sick way was a whole other thing. "Naruto?" Arashi had asked again, finally turning his head to face him. Sorry, I was just..." Naruto left the sentence hang and let go of Arashi's hand, wrapping his bare and scared arms around his orange-adorned knees. Arashi had sighed, dropped the piece of metal and ruffled Naruto's hair, saying, "It's okay. People like us admire weird things like this, but it's not all our fault we're like this, now is it?" Both were quiet for a long enough time for Arashi's small cuts and scratches clotted and were on their way to becoming nothing but scars. "So, you too? Even when you smile, you still want to?" Naruto asked. "Yeah, even when I smile I still feel like doing this," Arashi said with a nod to his arms, a small smile gracing his lips. Smiling back, Naruto chuckled slightly, saying, "Yeah, I guess people here are like that, two of a kind, right? Birds of a feather," Arashi said. When Arashi left the bathroom with Naruto and showed what he had done to one of the attendants, the man whom had been shown what had happened shook his head sadly, gently grabbed hold of Arashi's shoulders and led him away. Arashi stayed in solitary confinement for 2 days. Well, he did tell me he had a nightmare last night. Miyuki said knowingly when he told her the next day, helping her carry a basket of her, Arashi's and his laundry. Is that so? Hey Miyuki, what happened to him? What happened for him to come here? Naruto asked as he had placed the basket down next to several machines. She was quiet for a moment. Well, it's not really my place to say, but his parents, to put it bluntly, treated him like shit. That's awful? Yeah, it is. Miyuki had finished his sentence for him. There had been a silence for some time, one that was only filled with the sounds of gears of machines turning and clicking. He would note that the room they had walked in reminded him strongly of the public laundromats he'd seen in the village, and in all aspects, he was correct in thinking it was exactly like one, for that was exactly what it was. Is that all you seriously brought? Miyuki had asked as she began folding her clean clothes from the dryer. Pointing to the pair of pants, jacket and few shirts he threw into the washing machine, minus the clothes he already had on his back. Yeah, how do you start this thing? He had answered and asked all at once, pointing to the washing machine and giving it a slight kick with his bare foot. Miyuki gave him a look that said nothing but, "You're serious, aren't you? What, you've never used a washing machine before?" "No, I can't afford the laundromat and my apartment didn't come with one," Naruto answered, not missing the small miffed look that passed across her face. "How do you ever wash your clothes then?" she asked. "I've always washed them in the river near my apartment," he answered, giving the machine in front of him another good kick. Shrugging her shoulders, Miyuki stood for a moment, looking through and picking out a few outfits before scooting her way to Naruto, shoving the clothes into his hands, pouring soap flax into the machine's mouth, closing the lid and turning it on in one quick movement. "What are these?" Naruto had held the clothes that had been shoved into his hands up in question. "Clothes, duh. You didn't bring many so I'm lending you some, and don't worry, they're boyish enough that you won't look gay or anything," Miyuki had said. "What if they're too small?" Naruto had asked, placing the pile on top of the washer and holding one of the shirts up to his torso. "Try them on right now then silly. If they don't fit, I'm sure Arashi won't mind lending you some shirts and pants." He had huffed in an irritated sort of way, plopped down on the ground, and had taken off both jacket and undershirt when a hand had stopped him. "What is it?" Naruto had asked Miyuki as she kneeled down to eye level with him. "Your scars," she had said, fingers ghosting over the abused flesh with a sort of fascination Naruto had never seen directed at him before. "They're really something you know, and there's so many." Yanking his arm away and slipping the black shirt over his head quickly he had said, "Please don't. I don't like being touched. I'm not really used to it." "I'm sorry, but you can't really blame me for getting excited or fascinated like that," she had said, rolling her eyes in happy sarcasm and pulling her own sleeves down so similarly abused flesh could be seen. "Yeah," Naruto had said while helping her up, eyes glued for a moment to those arms, "I know. I told you they'd fit," Miyuki had said pointing to the black long-sleeved shirt that now hugged Naruto's developing frame nicely. For some reason, Naruto found the fact that he could fit into girls' clothes rather disturbing. And Naruto finding anything disturbing should be an explanation in itself. But all in all, the almost 2 weeks had been nice, minus his talks with his shrink, which seemed to be getting more and more personal now by the day. "So Naruto, how would you describe your childhood?" she had asked one day, rather late in the week. Whoa, don't change the subject on me lady, I wasn't even halfway through telling you what's wrong with our government. And especially don't try and make the subject personal," Naruto had said, putting his hands up as he spoke. His shrink sighed, pulling her glasses off for a moment to rub the bridge of her nose and putting them back on. She answered him. "Naruto, I'll tell you the truth about this whole thing. The administrators of this organization have noticed that you seem to be doing remarkably well, and may plan to release you much earlier than first intended." This, no doubt, had gotten Naruto's undivided attention in a second. "So, it is my job though to make sure their assumptions are true. Which means I have to go against my own judgment about taking things slow and push you into talking about things you might not like talking about, like your childhood. Do you see what I'm getting at?" she finished, raising an eyebrow as if to ask, "Got it, buddy?" Naruto's spirits lifted slightly at this. If he kept his smile up and acted like nothing was bugging him, he could get out of here. Then the chances of anyone finding out what he'd been through would be close to nil. "Yeah, I understand what you're getting at," he had answered. Oh yes, he knew what she was getting at. Choji and Asuma knew something was up. Something had to be up for Ino and Shikamaru to be acting like they were. Ino was quiet. Shikamaru was talking much more than usual. Ino was focused intently when it was time to spar. Shikamaru seemed to become very aloof, like his mind was on much more important things. Ino was acting calm, while Shikamaru was antsy. Did something happen between them? Asuma whispered quietly as the both stared at the pair, Ino staring at the clouds while Shikamaru wiggled his leg nervously, eyes staring at the ground. Not that I know of. Choji answered, pulling out a pack of chips and opening them. And as their training sessions continued over the days, what was happening seemed to get worse and worse, to the point it got so bad that even Ino and Shikamaru noticed it themselves. It got to such a point that Asuma and Choji silently agreed things couldn't get any more odd, that was until Shikamaru, Ino said loudly, acting like herself for the first time in a while, we need to talk. And funny thing was Shikamaru did as he was told, and followed her. And then that was when both Asuma and Choji decided that yes, something was most certainly wrong. Asuma, puffing on his cigarette, and Choji, who opened and was now eating another bag of chips, watched and were slightly amazed as the two walked off, Asuma saying to his student, I bet you it has something to do with going out with each other. Choji munched for a while thinking about what he should say. I bet it's about neither of them. Choji said without knowing how right he had been. Shikamaru, why have you been acting so weird lately? Ino asked bluntly as they walked through the forest. A sigh that sounded suspiciously like the word, troublesome, escaped his mouth as they continued walking. I could ask you the same thing, he said, composing himself enough to sound calm. They were quiet for some time, until Ino came to an abrupt halt, Shikamaru waiting for her to speak. You know, a little while ago, a week and a half or so, Sakura came into my family's flower shop crying and told me she needed to talk to me about Naruto, she said, her back still facing him. Shikamaru felt his heart drop down into his stomach, which was a feeling he rarely, and I mean rarely, ever had. Well, what did she say? He asked, keeping a calm tone and a cool face, even if she couldn't see his face. She told me he's staying in that Happy Hills place, and she told me why he's there too. Ino said in a calm tone that was not like her normal voice at all. Shikamaru heard her unspoken question though. Go with me there? I need to see it with my own eyes. Sighing irritably, Shikamaru grabbed her wrist, leading her towards the rehab center. This was getting ridiculous would be a good word for it. It seemed no matter what he did, he still could not get that infuriating blonde off of his mind, but it wasn't in a UAL way, mind you. It seemed no matter what he did, his sudden and rather surprising surges of worry for the blonde would not leave him be. No matter how much he exhausted his body with training, he didn't have a dream now that didn't have his mind making up horrible things he now knew Naruto was capable of doing to himself. No matter how much meditating he tried to delve himself into, his mind would always eventually bring up that image of scared arms, a bloody floor and deep blue eyes that blankly told him to keep his nose out of other people's business. And no matter how many times he told himself Naruto would be okay if he didn't visit him for a while, another voice in his mind would scream, in a completely un-Uchiha way I might add, that, no he wouldn't be okay. If he was alright, he wouldn't be in a place like that now would he? Listen to me, shit for brains. He is not going to be okay even if you and the rest of the world talks to him. You have to listen and understand. And for all you know he could be hacking away at himself right now for what you said to him. Go there and listen to what he has to say. Even if it's not much yet, he'll have loads to say eventually. It was unbelievably frustrating. Oh, by all means he knew he was worried sick, and for good reason. But that didn't mean he had to accept the fact and go all, mother hen, on his teammate and friend. But still, Sasuke would have liked it if he could understand a little better what the hell was going on to make Naruto do that to himself. That's why Sasuke had continually tried time and again in the last week and a half to try and remember what he himself had felt when he had done the same thing Naruto was doing. The scars were still there, but for some reason he could not piece together the feelings that went along with them. Oddly discolored lines trailing up his forearms to where wrappings now normally covered his skin. They were disgusting alright, but Sasuke could still faintly remember a time when he would look at those scars as if they were a solace to his problems, a safe haven that reminded him he was still alive and still felt. He hated it, the damage he had done to his body, and he was sure Naruto would eventually feel the same, given He had nowhere near as many scars as Naruto had, but still. It was when Sasuke brought that thought up that his mind began to understand his teammate a little bit better. He fell asleep that night on that thought, restless sleep tossing his mind to and fro. Sitting in a dimly lit room that he was fairly certain was familiar. Sasuke saw something glitter dimly in his hand from the soft light. A blade, with copper red dripping off its sharp end and the smell of new coins rising from the liquid red copper that fell to the floor to collect with the small puddle that already lay there. Catching sight of his small arms, Sasuke woke with a start, eyes immediately flying to his arms, relief washing over him as he saw nothing but a small number of scars, not a single drop of blood. He felt a warm liquid slide down his face and drop onto his hand. Tears, how stupid. But anyone would have cried. The dream had sent Sasuke's old emotions he had had when the massacre had first happened back in his face. It was an odd sense of nostalgia, wrapping its way around his lungs and heart, squeezing just to make it slightly hard for him to breathe. He could remember all those feelings again, the feeling as if there were no future to be ever seen, loneliness so deep and wide it rivaled the very seas, the feelings of a depression so severe it literally froze you. All of that had led him to do what he had once considered the only thing that could help him. Self-mutilation, cutting, whatever you like to call it. Yeah, at one point, the last real Uchiha had been one of the many people in the world to partake in such activities. Scrubbing angrily at his tearing eyes, Sasuke half-heartedly wished he wouldn't worry so much. And then, a familiar thought struck him, now with new meaning behind it. If he, Sasuke, had only done this much damage to himself, but had felt all of that, what must Naruto be feeling to do all of the damage he'd seen? Lying back down on the matter of his bed, he elbowed the poor pillow in frustration before pulling it to his chest. Sasuke would now silently reassure himself that his worry for his friend was not in fact stupid, but very, very, very well placed. Sakura was thinking, deeply thinking. Yes, what she had found out about her teammate was disturbing and downright one of the weirdest things she'd ever seen, especially the scars. It was solid proof to what he had done to himself. Depression in teenagers is characterized by a persistent sad mood, anger, feelings of hopelessness or the inability to feel pleasure or happiness for an extended period of time, weeks, months or years. It scared her to death, her friend and teammate, doing this to himself? She didn't understand it. There had never been any signs before this. He smiled so much and was always so happy and loud. Why would he be doing such a thing? Why? Early symptoms of adolescent depression can be difficult to diagnose because they appear to be a normal part of the difficulties adolescents face. Depression may be indicated if an adolescent experiences an unusual degree of the following symptoms for no apparent reason. 1. Changes in eating and sleeping habits, eating and sleeping too much or too little. 2. Missed school or poor school performance. 3. Withdrawal from friends and activities. 4. Indecision, lack of concentration, or forgetfulness. 5. Feelings of worthlessness or guilt. 6. Overreaction to criticism. 7. Feeling that nothing is worth the effort. 8. Frequent health complaints when no physical ailment exists. 9. Anger, rage, anxiety. 10. Lack of enthusiasm and motivation. 11. Drug, alcohol abuse, thoughts of death or suicide. Even if she hadn't pushed the subject when she had gone to see him, she still desperately wanted to know the answer to that question. Was it because she had been so mean to him when they were first teammates? She would be the first to admit she had mistreated him severely as a friend and comrade, always demeaning his own skills when hers were still lacking. What was the reasoning behind all of it? When had this whole thing started? From all of those scars, it couldn't have been something new. An old habit, God, and she had never noticed. Many teen behaviors or attitudes that are annoying to adults are actually indications of depression. Drug and alcohol use. Depressed teens often use substances in an attempt to self-medicate their symptoms. Low self-esteem. Depression can intensify feelings of ugliness and unworthiness. Eating disorders. Anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, or yo-yo dieting are often signs of unrecognized depression. Self-injury. Cutting, burning, headbanging, or other kinds of self-mutilation are almost always associated with depression. Acting out. Depression in teenagers may appear as agitation, aggression, or high-risk behaviors rather than or in addition to, gloominess. Suicidal thoughts or attempts. Teens who are seriously depressed or despondent often think, speak, or make attention-getting attempts at suicide, which should be taken seriously. Those scars, God, what had happened to him? Even when he smiled at her, he was still doing this habit. Whenever he had smiled at her, he was still hiding the fact he cut his flesh when he was stressed, or sad, or maybe even angry. Oh, she knew it took different amounts of mental pain to make someone do this to themselves. It always varied from person to person. Yes, like the good little scholar she'd always been, she had researched the topic of her interest. In this case, it was simply to understand better what must have happened to him. The reasons for depression can vary from adolescent to adolescent. Often, depression results from a confluence of factors. Personal experiences. Events such as the death of a loved one, divorce, a move to a new area, and even a breakup with a girlfriend or boyfriend can prompt symptoms. Adolescent depression can occur from neglect, prolonged absence from someone who is a source of care and nurturance, abuse and bullying, damage to self-esteem, or too many changes occurring in the life too quickly. In some teenagers, any major change may provoke depression. Earlier traumatic experiences. A young child who is a victim of abuse or incest does not have the life experience or language to understand what is happening, nor to protest. As the child becomes a teen, these painful experiences often emerge and cause great distress, which can be compounded if adults deny or discount the information. Stress. Especially if the adolescent lacks emotional support. Hormonal changes. The physical changes that occur during puberty are the result of hormones, which also cause new and unexpected emotions. Moodiness and melancholy are often experienced and labeled as depression. Medical conditions, such as hypothyroidism, can affect hormone balance and mood. Chronic physical illness also can cause depression. When a medical condition is diagnosed and treated by a doctor, the depression usually disappears. Substance abuse can cause changes in brain chemistry. Allergies to such foods as wheat, sugar, and milk cause or exacerbate symptoms of depression. Nutritional deficiencies may be caused by an amino acid imbalance or vitamin deficiency. Biology. Depression tends to run in families due to family predisposition. She knew all of this information, but what she didn't know was what exactly had happened to make Naruto do such an unhealthy thing, both mentally and physically. And like she had already said, that fact alone scared her senseless. Uzumaki-san, a familiar face said as the attendant beckoned him over to the doorway of his music therapy session. "You have 2 visitors here to see you," the woman whispered to him. Naruto physically depressed for a moment before perking, pulling on his trademark fox-like grin and followed the woman, not aware of the red pair of eyes that followed him. When he reached the waiting room, one person he would have expected, but the other not so much. "Shikamaru, Ino," he said the last name numbly, cursing his bad luck of having worn a borrowed short-sleeved shirt of Miyuki's. "Uzumaki Naruto," Ino said, an unfamiliar chill to her voice. "Ino," Shikamaru started before being cut off by the wave of Ino's hand. "How the hell could you do something like that? You scared Sakura so bad the other day she came to me crying, because she was worried about you," Ino said, the chill in her voice becoming stronger. Naruto stayed quiet, letting her words roll over him, a smile still held in place. "Ino," Shikamaru said sternly, "I'm not done. How could you keep this from us? How could you do something like this to begin with? What are you, a freak? Shut up." A voice neither Ino nor Shikamaru recognized, its owner stepping quickly out of the corner she hid behind. Rage built up in her naturally red eyes. "Shut up, you inconsiderate, narrow-minded bitch. How can you say something like that to him? How? You," Miyuki said, jabbing her fingers sharply into the air, pointing it at Ino, "have no idea what he feels. You're supposed to be his friend or maybe even just an acquaintance, but still, you don't say shit like that. Don't you think he feels crummy enough without you calling him a freak?" Miyuki stopped for a moment as Ino interrupted. And how would you know how he feels? It's not like you know what he's doing." Pulling up her left sleeve sharply, Miyuki marched deliberately over to the blonde, shoving the forearm into her face, not taking it away until Ino stepped back, a rather horror-struck look plastered onto her face. The only reaction she received from Shikamaru was an arch of his eyebrow. "Think I'm a freak too? I don't care what you think about me, but I think you should study more on what you're going to criticize before doing so. We do this because we don't know anything else. You had parents to love you your whole life. They taught you how to work things out without doing something stupid to try and fix it. We didn't have anyone like that. While your parents were making sure for you that there wasn't a monster in your closet after you had a bad dream, my dad became the monster in my closet and was my own fucking nightmare. Miyuki continued, tears now falling quietly down her face. But Ino started weakly before Miyuki held up for her hand. I don't care if you or Naruto's other friends are scared that reality's ugly head has finally shot itself up your ass. Blaming him isn't going to help. It's not his fault, she finally finished, taking off like a jet back around the corner she'd come from, tears still streaming down her face. Slumping to the floor, Ino, tears of shock fall down her face. Hey, I'm sorry. It was Naruto who spoke, walking over and crouching down to Ino, wiping a tear away from her face. For some reason, this just seemed to make Ino cry even harder. She's right, was all Ino said as Naruto tried to calm her down. Even after all that she had said to him, he was the one apologizing for something she had wrongly blamed him for. God, Ino couldn't help thinking, why is he such a good person? She wanted to come, Shikamaru said simply. Of course Naruto didn't miss the glances the young Chunin threw at his exposed arms. Shikamaru, Naruto said, coming to a decision right then and there. You can tell the others where I am. I give you permission to. Shikamaru was silent as he helped Ino to her feet, waiting for the other blonde to rise as well before giving an answer. Alright, but I hope you know it won't be very pretty. Giving Shikamaru one of his famous grins, he nodded, saying, of course I knew that. Turning abruptly, Naruto started walking back down the hall. Naruto, Shikamaru called, all but to receive nothing but a short pause in the boy's stride. Had Naruto turned around, he would have seen Shikamaru give him one of the saddest looks ever to be seen on the lazy ninja's face. Naruto kept that grin in place as he made his way back to music therapy, letting it drop once he knew they could no longer see him. Letting out a sharp breath he had been holding, Naruto slammed his fist sharply into the wall, savoring the pain that racked his knuckles as he felt some skin rip slightly open. Breaths coming in small short gasps, he leaned his shoulder onto the wall, fully aware he could start hyperventilating if he did not calm his breathing down. Why had he given them permission to tell the others? Oh God, they'd find out, and would come marching over here, wanting to know what was going on. He knew he wouldn't be able to handle that, especially if they all started pitying him. Oh, how he would hate that. And all of them asking at once, why? There was no way he would be able to handle that. The real answer behind that question had so many little and big answers to it that there was hardly any way to recount each and every one of those reasons. If it were possible, which it apparently was, Naruto's breathing picked up a notch or two at the mere thought. Rapping his fist harshly on his forehead, he asked himself out loud through his erratic breathing. Why stupid? Huh? Why? Two slender arms wrapped themselves around his shoulders and for a moment, Naruto forgot to breathe. I know you don't like being touched, but I don't know any other way to say sorry. Miyuki spoke into his shoulders. Realizing who it was, Naruto's breathing started again. You didn't do anything, he said after a few deep and calming breaths. Yeah, I did. I butted my nose into your business and I shouldn't have, and I upset you. That's not why I'm angry. Then, Miyuki began, arms wrapped around Naruto the entire time. Why are you angry? Naruto sighed, picking his arms up to touch the hands wrapped around his shoulders, saying, I think I just royally fucked things up, that's all. How so? I gave them permission to tell my other friends where and why I'm here. Miyuki sighed, saying, this news might make you feel better. You know, this entire section gets to go to the fall festival tomorrow. It's the 31st, you know. Miyuki said, your 13th birthday, right? Naruto could feel the smile that formed on the girl's face as she buried her face into his back. What you said about your dad, did he really become a monster? Naruto asked quietly. She was silent for a moment or two, arms never leaving Naruto, even as she spoke. I'll tell you one of my secrets if you tell me one of yours. Alright, Naruto said, knowing one thing that was safe to tell her about himself. Miyuki sighed deeply, her breath blowing through the thin material of the shirt. When my mom killed herself and my baby brother, my dad became a monster that had hurt me and let his friends hurt me too. She said, quivering slightly as she spoke. The first time I tried to kill myself was when I was 4.5. I drank half a gallon of bleach and I still didn't die," Naruto said in a scary calm voice. Naruto felt those pale arms squeeze tightly around him before they let him go. "Life royally sucks," Miyuki said simply. All of the people whom sat in Yamanaka Ino's bedroom were quite surprised. Each of the rather young genins had to wonder exactly what the hell was going on. To have received an urgent note saying to meet at the Yamanaka household for a needed meeting, everyone found this very odd. To begin with, everyone had thought she'd ask them something along the lines of, "Do I look good in this dress?" or "Who's prettier, me or Forehead Girl?" But upon arriving, they found a rather different Ino than what they were used to. Eyes slightly red-rimmed and an aura of all seriousness surrounding her, one which none had felt before from her. They all defiantly knew something had happened. The fact that she did not start going into fangirl mode when Sasuke graced her room with his presence sealed the deal. "Why did you call all of us here?" Kiba asked irritably from his spot on her bedroom floor. Ino merely glared at him, begging after a look to Shikamaru, whom simply nodded. "I had all you come over here today because I need to tell you something Naruto gave me permission to tell you." And with those words, everyone sat at attention, all except for Sasuke and Sakura, who both already knew what was going to be said. Super long an. Excuse my random, Miyuki appearing out of nowhere, thing I sort of did this chapter and my slight OOC Sasuke. Yeah, I don't think this chapter is all too good, but I tried. Allergit, so as you all know, the re-entry to school is just around the bend. Knowing me, I'll be busy most of the school year, so expect maybe another chapter or two before I go quiet for a while. Please don't give up on me. I've had this idea of a FIC brewing in me since the summer before I started 8th grade. I'm a sophomore in high school now. So yeah, just a warning to you all. I'm sorry to you Ino fans who happened to read this if I made her seem bitchy, but that's how I thought she'd react. As for the next chapter, rejoice, for they are going outside for a whole day to go to the fall festival. Yay, I'm going to have fun with that chapter and I know you'll like reading it. So now, I have only a few, things to ask of you guys. Number 1, please review. I'm not threatening to not update if you don't, that would be stupid, immature, and all around pathetic. But my self-esteem as a writer would greatly appreciate it. It's not that I don't appreciate all the reviews I get already, it's just, a few of you have my story on your faves. And alerts and all that and I've never heard a peep from you. Tell me what you think. I don't mind if it's as simple as a, "Please update, I really like your FIC." sort of thing. I don't even care if it goes the other way and turns into a flame. I will eat the fire. Just tell me if you like it or not. Number 2, I'd really like it if you'd all tell me what you think this FIC needs. Or doesn't need, for it to become better. Tell me if you think I have a problem in my writing style or characterization. All of your opinions will be taken into consideration and I will try to improve to all of you likings. Well, that should be it. Oh. And by the way, if you have time, mind stopping by my profile and checking out my FIC ideas? Oh, and please do click on the link, near or at the bottom. I have where I basically wrote, "Go here. Watch this and then thank me." It's defiantly worth your time to watch it. Giggles. See ya. That's all for now. If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments.